how humans survived in every time period. This is you, the average, everyday, modern human being. Historically speaking, you are soft, squishy, and weak. And although you may not look like it, you are an apex predator, residing at the very top of the global food chain. But this has not always been the case, and this evolution of human dominance has taken hundreds of thousands of years to manifest. And where it's gotten us is you laying on the couch ordering Uber Eats without a care in the world. But the struggles that humanity has faced to get us to this very position is anything but pretty. And it's for this very reason that we are going to be investigating exactly how humans endured and survived every era of history, as well as seeing what it would take for a modern human to survive in previous time periods. Let's begin. The Stone Age. The first thing you're going to notice after being dropped in the Stone Age is the sheer shock of how little you truly have. In the Stone Age, you have no phone, wallet, glasses, watch, clothes. You are truly left to your own devices, and it's up to you to figure out how to survive. Luckily, not too far in the distance, you notice a small tribe of humans, and you know better than to interact with them, so you start by observing them. One of the first things you notice is how little these people have. This small tribe of humans have animal pelts draped over their body, and beyond that, appear to only have a pile of rocks and sticks at their disposal. The settlement that they're in is rudimentary and looks almost temporary, and that's because humans at this point in the early Stone Age are still primarily nomadic, meaning that long-term settlements aren't established yet. And although these people are occupying this area now, they likely won't be there in a few months, as they will likely seasonally follow animals in different weather patterns. Taking a closer look at this pile of sticks, you notice that they're not just sticks, they're actually tools. And these rocks that they're carrying all serve a purpose. Some of these longer sticks have pointed, jagged rocks at the ends, while some of the shorter sticks have large black rocks attached to them. And you notice that these are spears and obsidian axes. You notice one of these people actually creating these tools. They are literally using stones to carve out other stones. At this point, you're already taking a mental note of how simple the Stone Age appears to be in comparison to the modern day. And while that is definitely true, it's important to also note that just because something is simple, it does not mean that it's easy. Besides just sitting around and crafting stone tools that literally define this entire time period, there are a lot of other skills required to survive. One of the more unlikely culprits is actually social skills, which may seem a bit random, but when you think about it, your tribe in the Stone Age is literally your lifeline. Every aspect of life is so time-consuming and takes so much effort. Collecting food, cooking food, fabricating tools, preparing pelts, migrating. Literally everything takes so long. And it truly does take a village in the Stone Age just to support each other, because everybody plays their role. We are talking about real hunter-gatherer times. And it's for this reason that you need to provide value to the group that you live in. Because if you are in a group and you are unable to perform in any aspect of your tribe, there's a very likely chance that you're going to be exiled. If your gathering sessions are consistently unfruitful, and if you are simply not pulling your weight in the group, then the entire group is going to have to make the decision between picking up your slack or cutting off the weakest link and exiling you from the tribe. And during a time where every day is a struggle to survive, you do not even have the luxury of picking up anybody else's slack. And for the edgy lone wolves watching this video, being alone in the Stone Age may not seem like such a bad thing, until you realize that not only does every aspect of life require a group to truly thrive, but in this time period, you're also susceptible not only to nature, but natural predators. Because that's right, in the Stone Age, humans definitely have natural predators. And if one of these predators see a lone human walking around, they're either going to assume you're old, sick, exiled, lost, and it doesn't really matter which one is the case, because in any of those instances, you are vulnerable, meaning that a predator can easily make you lunch. With this new realization, you decide to introduce yourself to this group and make yourself at home, because the only way you as a modern person has any chance is by making some good friends. Fortunately, this tribe takes you in, but you are tasked with your first job, making fire. Another essential skill of Stone Age survival. As you gather a few sticks, you realize that the entire tribe is looking at you. And they didn't give you this task as a job, they gave it to you as a test. Because if you can't start a fire, then there is absolutely no way you can pull any weight, and they're better off leaving you behind. Although fortunately for you, you watched Survivor Man a time or two and spun a stick on a log like your life depended on it, getting a kindling going, and then a small fire, proving your worth to the group and ensuring your survival, at least for that day. As the day goes on, you are informed that it's now time to hunt. The tribe has sharpened tools, a new fire, and it's time to eat. And you're being invited to hunt with the tribe. With no other option, you accept the offer and you begin on the journey. One of the first things you realize is that while these people may be human, they are definitely not the same as you, because their endurance is next level. These hunters that you are struggling to keep up with can seemingly run for days. And not only that, they know exactly where they're going and they can read the landscape like the back of their hands. This deep connection to the landscape you inhabit is crucial for long-lasting survival in the wild. And as a modern human, it's a skill set you're going to have to develop. But for a Stone Age human, this is the only life you know, because you are still deeply connected and ingrained in nature. After a successful hunt, you return back to the camp exhausted, while the others you went out with seem barely phased at all. And that's because for you, this was the workout of a lifetime. But for these prehistoric people, this was simply everyday life. And this experience gave you a lot of context into how humans survived in the Stone Age. Survival wasn't a hobby or a job or entertainment. Survival was a daily task, day in and day out. And there was no work-life balance, because your life was work. And anything you needed, you had to work for. The clothes on your back, the food in your stomach, the wood in the fire, the stone on your spear, the cave that you're sleeping in. Everything required effort. And with that, we understand that Stone Age humans survived because of their deep understanding of the landscape that they inhabited. And these skills allowed them to consistently find places to live temporarily or even long term. And on top of their geographical knowledge, their ability to fashion tools out of materials simply laying on the ground is extremely impressive, and allowed them to not only catch animals and protect themselves, but also to create clothing and process food and make other tools. And with that, if you could understand the landscape and develop your own tools, then the only other thing you really needed was the ability to create fire. And with that, you had every aspect of life essentially covered. Besides, obviously, shelter and water, but those are also part of understanding the landscape, because the water that you get comes from natural sources. And during the early Stone Age, most of the places you inhabit are also typically natural structures, or extremely simple structures made using natural materials. Because of this experience you've had with these Stone Age people, you've gained a newfound respect for prehistoric humans. And although you now have a better understanding of how cave people lived, you also are very certain that you want to spend no more time during the Stone Age, because you've been spoiled by the modern day, and the Stone Age is interesting, but it also makes camping look like a 5-star resort. And with that, we decide it's time to move on to the next time period. The Bronze Age. One of the first things you need to be aware of before we drop you into the Bronze Age is this. The Stone Age literally took place over the course of millions of years. But the Bronze Age is where we truly see the beginning of human technological development hit an exponential point. Because what humans are about to develop over the next couple thousand years is going to make the development over the millions of years in the Stone Age seem like child's play. Although it was obviously a necessary part of our human development. After being dropped in the Bronze Age, you almost don't recognize the world that you were looking at. Obviously, there are some glaring similarities between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age, but the differences are stark. One of the first things you notice is that the people aren't wearing pelts anymore. They're wearing clothes. And now you feel underdressed because you're the only one wearing a loincloth. But beyond just the clothing that people are wearing, society looks completely different than it did in the Stone Age. In the Bronze Age, we see people begin to create settlements. And with that, we see agriculture, we see animal farming, we see settlements. And for the first time, we see two very important innovations. We see metal forging and we see the wheel. The collection and forging of metals is what obviously separates the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. And while upgrading from obsidian tools to copper swords is definitely an improvement and ensures that tools are able to last a lot longer, it isn't the only notable change by far. Having tools made in a new material is cool, but having a new material that allows the door to open for expertise to flourish and for unique tools to exist definitely opened up the floodgates for more innovation. With metal forging existing, we now have a method for creative people to develop and hone in their skills. And instead of relying on using a dull rock to sharpen a sharp rock, we now have the opportunity to create nearly anything we can imagine, at least for the time. And with that, the simple introduction of this new metal alone, society begins to evolve, because now we have artisans and experts, and then we have early jobs and an early economy based off of these new items and metals. And things are already developing at a pace quicker than I can describe. But besides just having new metals and new jobs because of it, we also have the wheel. And the wheel was crucial for literally mobilizing society. Not only did we see civilization establish settlements in the Bronze Age, but we also saw settlements become connected because of the wheel. And these settlements became connected through trade routes and war. Two things that also went on to further evolve society. However, even with all of these revolutionary technological developments, the Bronze Age to a modern human still seems like an extremely slow and barbaric way of life. And for that reason, you need to learn exactly how to acclimate to this time period. Fortunately, the development you found yourself near has almost everything a human could need. And one of the first things you do is get yourself some new drip, because that loincloth had the ladies and the men looking at you the wrong way. Walking through this village, you understand that community is still extremely important. However, this stage of the game, by game I mean history, is a lot less grindy. Instead of spending all day looking for berries, you are simply picking the berries in the garden. Instead of spending the entire day looking for a goat, you are simply taking one from the farm. And instead of feeling like you have to do everything all the time, for the first time you feel like you actually have the opportunity to specialize and focus on something. And although things are definitely looking a lot better than they did in the Stone Age, in the Bronze Age, you still need to make sure that you're carrying your own weight. Because at the end of the day, you need to put a roof over your head and food in your stomach today. And what that means is you once again need to provide value. And while the value you provide in the Bronze Age looks different than the Stone Age, the general concept still applies. There are no free lunches, and if you want to survive, you need to do something. Although in the Bronze Age, there are more opportunities. Since your goal is survival, you decide that joining any sort of army is not for you, and you're also not interested in any form of combat sport involving a copper sword. You briefly ponder potentially becoming a criminal, because then anything you want is free. Although, after seeing how basically every crime can be punishable by death during this period of time, you realize that a modest job may be your best way of surviving. Even though there's a lot more technology in the Bronze Age, the components required for life are still the same. You need food, water, and shelter. And the one job that you identify that can provide you all of this is farming. Because of the new tools and methods introduced in the Bronze Age, mass farming is at an all-time high, at least relatively. And for that reason, there's a lot of opportunity to work within farming. And a lot of these jobs provide food, shelter, and water in return for your all-day, indefinite, back-breaking labor. It's not glamorous, but your goal here is survival. You're not trying to be rich or famous, you simply just want to live a long, safe life. But after making yourself useful on the farm and breaking your back, even though you now have new tools, a wheel, and new clothes, you decide it's time to continue moving. Because although the Bronze Age and the Stone Age feel like night and day in human history, you know that there's a lot more to come and you want to experience it. The Iron Age. The difference between Bronze Age and Iron Age is not nearly as shocking as the difference between Stone Age and Bronze Age. However, it doesn't mean that the advancements are any less important. During the Iron Age, we don't necessarily see an entirely new way of life, although we see an expansion upon the previously established way of life in the Bronze Age, with some improvements. Obviously, the most notable difference being the new metal at play. Iron changed the metal tool game like never before, and that's because it was readily available and extremely durable. And because of that, iron tools became economical. And what that means is not only was there some tools, there was a lot of tools. And with more tools being in the hands of more people, human development began to ramp up even quicker than before. And because of this, we start to see society truly hit scale. Farming, both agriculture and livestock, became more optimized. Iron mining became more optimized. Metal forging became more optimized, and there was more of it. And because of this, everything that the Bronze Age really established, the Iron Age was able to run with. And that's kind of a common theme in every time period so far. Every lesson, development, technique developed in the previous time period can be applied and expanded upon in the next one. And that's kind of life in general, if you think about it. Regardless, with yourself being dropped in the Iron Age, my advice to you on surviving wouldn't be much different from the Bronze Age. Make sure you are refining your social skills to have a good circle of people around you, and make sure that you are obeying the law. Make sure you're not getting yourself into any wars, and make sure that you're making yourself valuable without making yourself a target. Since you already have experience from farming in the Bronze Age, I would recommend farming once again in the Iron Age. You can make a living, afford shelter, afford food, be around water, and if everything took a nasty turn, you at least have the skill set to provide for yourself if all else fails. And might I add, in this time period, to take up some sort of sword fighting hobby in the background. Not because you want to fight in a war, but because you want to be able to protect yourself in any situation. And like they say, it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. The medieval era. One of the first things you notice after landing yourself specifically in medieval England is the difference in people. There's civilizations like you saw in the Iron Age, although this civilization is different. It's obviously more developed, but one of the biggest things you notice is the sheer amount of class separation. Most of the people you see roaming the streets don't look super different than they did in the Iron Age. Although you do see almost a new class of people. You see merchants with elaborate clothing. You see nobility with clean robes. And you even get a glimpse of the king going down the street. And it's with this initial impression that you realize that you're not in Kansas anymore. Besides the differences that you see, there's a big difference that you can smell. Because being smack dab in the middle of medieval England, you can smell everybody and everything. And that's because with how developed cities have become, people are being more and more crammed into smaller and smaller places. And for that reason, everybody is literally in everybody else's business. And if you thought working on a farm in the Iron Age smelled bad, well, just smell medieval England. And make sure you keep your mouth closed if you see anybody on the second floor dropping fudge popsicles out of a bucket from their window. After noticing this rather large wealth gap, you understand that if you want to survive, your best chance is by at least having a bit of money. Because the vast majority of poor serfs, unless they are skilled laborers that are able to stay in town, are typically sent to the countryside for agricultural jobs. And while that was something you have experience in, you don't want to slave your life away anymore. And the life of a serf in medieval times is typically not one that screams longevity. Long hours, poor food, poor health healthcare, no education, unsafe work conditions. There's a lot that could go wrong. And for that reason, with your goal of surviving, you want to have at least a few shillings in your pocket. You end up cozying up to a local sword merchant. And while this is a suitable side gig and you're able to learn the business and grow within the company, you realize that this society is a lot more complex than previous times. Obviously, royalty is relatively new in your historical travels, but on top of this, religion is a massive staple, not only in day-to-day life, but also in your survival. In medieval England, the Roman Catholic Church ruled over everything. And for that reason, if you were not following the rules of the church, you could be fined. And if you publicly disobeyed or potentially disagreed with the church, you could be killed. Which is why you quickly begin to study the Bible and learn a few prayers in Latin. After getting your side gig and getting familiar with the local customs, you are now met once again with the harsh reality of sickness. While human development has brought us new major cities, we are now experiencing the downfall of some of these overcramped and unsanitary cities, specifically plagues. And if you just happen to be living through 1348, your best chance of survival would be leaving the city immediately and taking the skills you learned in the Stone and Bronze and Iron Age to live off the land yourself. Because during the plague, even buying bread from somebody could be a death sentence. But outside of these relatively niche plague times, there is still the overarching lack of healthcare. Obviously, there was basically none in any of the previous time periods, but in the medieval era specifically, there was at least development with healthcare, but a lot of these treatments were actually more harm than good, meaning that if literally anything went wrong, whether it be a broken bone or a small cut, if you weren't in perfectly good shape and perfectly healthy, you were much closer to death than you would have ever been in the modern day. But even if you were lucky enough to be surviving in the medieval era during a time when there was no plague, you had a job that was making you not a poor serf, you still had to hope to God, literally, that there was not a war on the horizon. Because if you, as a young adult, were summoned to war, you essentially had no option. Either go to war or be killed for not going to war. And if you went to war and got injured, your chances of dying were high. And if you went to war and got injured and survived, once you came home, you would not be able to continue your work and you would essentially be poor on the street and likely die on that street. And with that hard lesson learned, you realize that if you want to survive in medieval times, you need to not only work a job, but be savvy enough to earn a higher than normal income. You have to religiously follow the church. You must never break a law. You must never upset a royal. You must never be in bad health or become injured. And you must hope that a war never breaks out that requires your assistance. And spoiler alert, there was a lot of wars during the Middle Ages. And while you actually find the Middle Ages rather interesting, you know that this was not the place for you. And you decide to continue your journey. The early modern era. The early modern era is the shortest time period we're going to discuss on this list, besides the modern era, which is still ongoing. The early modern era was only 300 years long, spanning from 1500 to 1800 AD. But this time period was pivotal for human civilization. And while it consists of a lot of the things we've already discussed previously, the early modern era specifically is defined not by metals, but by intellectual pursuits, specifically in major developments in both world exploration and scientific pursuits. With the prosperity that Europe saw during the Middle Ages, they decided that their best next course of action during the early modern era was to begin expanding, which is why we saw a plethora of colonization during this time, because these European countries wanted more land, more wealth, more power. And because of this, the early part of the early modern era is rather tumultuous. There is a lot of religious instability, and also instability across the globe with this newfound colonization. And because literally so many revolutions took place during the early modern era, if you have to be a part of one of the revolutions, I would recommend being a part of the scientific revolution, specifically by trying to get your name in the same group as Copernicus, Galileo, or Newton. And while you might be thinking, I'm not nearly as smart as any of those guys, you don't need to be. Because if you're a modern person just being dropped in the early modern era, then you have a plethora of knowledge that you could use to change the world early and make yourself not only a remembered scientist, but also literally a god. But also keep in mind that revealing too much knowledge would actually not get you respected, it would get you killed, because you would just seem crazy. And if you challenge the status quo too much, well, that wouldn't be good for you. So with your goal of survival, you drop hints about knowing things and become a respected philosopher, making sure that you stay vague, but also inspirational. Near the end of the early modern era, you begin to see things that you recognize from the modern era. You see democracy, capitalism, banking, personal individuality, and this is all a part of the Enlightenment near the end of the early modern era. And it's with this realization that you remember that you're almost home. You've been going through almost all of human history, and now your final step is going back to the modern day. And while your time in every different time period has been brutal and tough, and you've missed even the most modern of luxuries like Uber Eats and a toilet, you've definitely grown to respect previous eras of history, and you've had a major boost in respect for people who came before you, and essentially paved the way for you to live the comfortable life you live today. And with that, you realize that there's only one more place to go, and that's returning home, the modern era. Obviously, if you want to know how to live in the modern era, go look in the mirror or ask your grandpa. But I want to point out some interesting nuances that separated the early modern era from the modern era, because the modern era isn't just this week or this month. It dates back all the way to the early 1800s. And even though it was less than 200 years ago, the early 1800s is a much different time and lifestyle than the 2020s. One of the biggest technological advancements during the modern era is the Industrial Revolution, which swept through Europe, America, and eventually the world, and changed not only jobs and economies, but lives forever. But the Industrial Revolution wasn't just the building of factories and a boost in manufacturing jobs. It also meant further development in urban areas, specifically with developments in mining and transportation, with trains, buggies, and eventually cars becoming popular. And these tools, once again, changed the world and allowed further and further exponential development. And while this Industrial Revolution definitely improved the quality of life of some, there is undoubtedly still horrible labor conditions existing for those working in factories. And this includes women and children being paid next to nothing for backbreaking and then sometimes deadly jobs. But it's once again these hardships that people go through that brings us to the modern day, 2025. Now, this is not to say that the modern day is perfect, because it's not by any means. And this also isn't to say that every hardship in the past has been justified because it led us to today. Although, what I am trying to say is that the world we live in today is a work in progress and has been developed by hundreds of thousands of years of human development, driven by the urge to do better and never give up. Humans have always endured, persevered, and grew. And if you look at the timeline of humanity, that is a fact. So, although in the modern day we may have our own issues and be squishier than we used to be, we are still actively participating in this ongoing pursuit of human development, and humans, at the end of the day, are badasses. While there's definitely issues in the modern day, life has never been more comfortable and convenient, and easier to at least stay alive in. Crazy declassified FBI secrets you didn't know about. The Bigfoot files. Nope, you heard me right. There is a declassified document directly from the FBI regarding Bigfoot. And of course it confirms the existence of Bigfoot, right? Not exactly. Oh, and keep in mind, this video only gets crazier as the video goes on. So if the first thing we're discussing is a declassified FBI document on Bigfoot, well, just wait and see what we end up talking about later in the video. But with that being said, the FBI didn't confirm the existence of Bigfoot, but they did have a very interesting situation surrounding a supposed Bigfoot fur sample. In the year 1976, a man named Peter Byron, the director of the Bigfoot Information Center and Exhibition in Oregon at the time, wrote a letter directly to the FBI asking if they'd be willing to test a sample of some alleged Bigfoot hair that they had. Peter isn't just some random guy. Not only was he the director of the Bigfoot Information Center, but he's also a zoologist. Well, a cryptozoologist, which, if you don't know what that means, it's basically just somebody who researches cryptids, and there's no actual backing behind the term. Regardless, those are his qualifications. And apparently that was enough to get the FBI not only to respond, but to take his request seriously. The assistant director of the FBI's Scientific and Technical Services Division responded to Peter directly, and even told Peter that in the past, the FBI had actually examined other examples of physical evidence related to Bigfoot. So this wasn't necessarily uncommon for the FBI. The FBI had the results from the test, and they informed Peter that the hair sample that he had and claimed was from Bigfoot was actually, in all likelihood, from a deer. At that point, the case was filed and hidden away for decades. That was until 2019, when the FBI declassified this document and released all 22 pages inside of it, which includes all of the correspondence between the FBI and Peter, all of the lab results, and all of the internal memos associated with this entire claim. To me, the craziest part about this entire situation is the fact that the FBI took this request for DNA sampling on a alleged Bigfoot hair seriously, and the fact that they did this during the time that Ted Bundy was literally on the loose. Like, the FBI was looking for Ted Bundy, and they were like, well, I mean, Ted Bundy's on the loose, but we also might have Bigfoot hair, so the timing on that is crazy. And obviously it's a big organization, but it's just a funny thought. But if nothing else, in 2019, when the FBI finally declassified the Bigfoot files, well, a lot of people were probably really excited until they actually read what the file contained. The Silver Master Spy Ring. The Silver Master Spy Ring, or internally known at the FBI as the Silver Master File, was a declassified document of the FBI that contained 162 volumes and over 26,000 total pages, which ultimately revealed that during the Cold War, there was a massive ring of spies in the US government that were, first of all, high-ranking, and second of all, secretly collecting and sending sensitive information directly to the Soviet Union. If you watched one of our last conspiracy theory videos, then you would have heard me talk about Operation Snow White, which in short was the operation conducted by Scientology to infiltrate the US government, which they were extremely successful at doing. But the Silver Master File takes place just before the Cold War and during most of the Cold War. This case goes back as early as 1945, when a defector of the Soviet Union came to the United States and worked in the United States government. but she wasn't the spy. She was actually the one who ratted on the spy. This woman's name was Elizabeth Bentley, and she used to work for the Soviet Union as a courier, and so she was aware of information coming into and leaving the Soviet Union. And during her time working as a courier for the Soviet Union, she realized that there was a lot of information coming from the States, specifically from a man named Nathan Gregory Silvermaster. And when Elizabeth Bentley defected from the Soviet Union and actually came to the United States, she was ready to spill the beans. But unfortunately, that was something that Nathan Gregory Silvermaster had been doing for a long time. Nathan was an economist for the United States War Production Board during World War II, meaning that he played an extremely important and sensitive role within the US government, especially in regards to foreign affairs. However, even though Nathan played such a strategic role within the United States government, he wasn't on the United States' side. Silvermaster really has an odd background too, because he was born in 1898 in Odessa, Russia, but then moved to China of all places. And what did he do in China? Obviously, he learned English. And he learned how to speak English perfectly with a British accent in China. He emigrated from China to the United States of America, where he went to university, got a PhD, and became an American citizen in 1926. Interestingly, during this time, Nathan was an outspoken communist. Even in university, the thesis he wrote was titled Lenin's Economic Thought Prior to the October Revolution, which alone isn't damning, but I mean, it's definitely a red flag. But I wasn't able to read this actual thesis, so I can't necessarily give my thoughts on what he mentioned because you could be on either side of this. But he was also, on top of both of these things, reported to be in contact with a very large number of Communist Party USA officials, and was even an active member of numerous communist front groups in the United States. However, with all of this being known, the US decided that this person would be great to hire on just before and during the Cold War, and it totally backfired. Like I mentioned, Silvermaster was a spy and was sending sensitive documents directly to the Soviet Union. He himself was specifically focusing on sending reports on US arms production, which was basically sensitive information reports on bombers, planes, tanks, guns, radar and submarines, and things like that. Basically anything sensitive to do with American weaponry that Nathan could get his hands on, he was taking a picture of and sending to the Soviet Union. But as I mentioned, this was a spy ring. He didn't work alone, and he was coordinating with a dozen other Soviet operatives. And these people worked in the Army, in the Department of Agriculture, and in the Office of Strategic Services, which was the agency that came before the CIA. All 12 of these people were consistently sending sensitive documents to the Soviet Union, which on top of Nathan's leaks also included war strategy, nuclear weapons developments, and other forms of diplomatic communications. Basically anything that they could leak that would be of benefit to the Soviet Union, they were sending. And they could do so because they had so much access, as these were all high-ranking spies. Because of the tip that the FBI got from Elizabeth Bentley about Silvermaster being a potential spy, the government over the next 3 years paid extra attention to Silvermaster specifically and others in the FBI at the time. And after those 3 years and 26,000 pages later, the government had their 12 guys. But surprisingly, even though there was a huge data breach within the US government, almost nobody who was a part of the spy ring was actually ever prosecuted. Mainly because if the FBI wanted to prosecute these people, they would have had to expose a lot of secrets about data collection, and to them, it wasn't worth it, and it was more of a national security risk to prosecute them than to just kick them out of the US government. Operation Shocker. Operation Shocker was a secret FBI counterintelligence operation that took place from 1959 all the way through 1982. And its sole goal was to deceive the Soviet Union's military intelligence agency, specifically by feeding them fake information. I knew I obviously had to put Operation Shocker after the Silvermaster files because it just makes so much sense. Operation Shocker centers around one man, Joseph Edward Cassidy. He was a U.S. Army first sergeant, and his job was to pretend to defect from the United States of America to help aid the Soviets. And after getting full approval from the U.S. Army, he was officially able to work as a double agent. He of course had to start by building trust with the Soviet Union, which is exactly what he did, and he gave the Soviets real information that was very low risk, but it was enough to build trust. And once the relationship between Cassidy and the Soviet Union was established, that's when the shenanigans really began to start, as Cassidy would slowly feed the Soviet Union fake documents. But not just a few. Over the course of this operation, Cassidy fed the Soviets over 4,000 documents. One of the main focuses of a lot of these documents were about a fictional nerve agent that the United States government was developing. The point of this information on this fake nerve agent was to A, make the Russians paranoid, and B, make them spend time and money developing and researching a nerve agent that didn't exist. And while Operation Shocker very likely caused the Soviet Union to waste time, energy, and resources on developing an antidote and protection measures from this fictional nerve agent and possibly causing them fear of what the United States may do with this nerve agent, this operation was definitely not fully beneficial for the United States. Firstly, because 2 FBI agents actually died in a plane crash while conducting surveillance for Operation Shocker, and because this operation was so secret, the families of the agents that died were told lies about the entire thing until this was later declassified. But besides the FBI agents that were killed, it's suspected that because the US government was feeding fake information about a nerve agent to the Soviet Union, this caused the Soviets to begin researching their own nerve agent. And because of that, the Soviets did develop a very real nerve agent, which was known as Novichok. Up until this time, the Operation Shocker documents were declassified. Nobody besides a few high-ranking agents in the FBI were even aware of the true full scope of Operation Shocker. But today, everybody knows the truth. And I'm really hoping that the families of the lost FBI agents know the truth as well. Because imagine if they didn't know and you're just laying on your bed watching a YouTube video and you know the truth and they still don't. Operation Shocker was truly a shocker. Operation Washtub. Operation Washtub, once again, was a Cold War era program launched by the United States government. And while this is going to be the last thing involving Russia I'm going to put on this list, it's too good not to mention, and this is actually probably the coolest out of the 3. During the 1950s, the US Air Force and the FBI were both very concerned that if the Soviets were going to attack America, they were going to do so through Alaska. And because of this, the FBI took action by training Alaskan civilians in covert operations. The FBI selectively chose local fishermen, bush pilots, trappers, and basically any rootin' tootin' tough guy in Alaska they could find that were A, familiar with the landscape, and B, could survive off-grid in Alaska. Once they had collected these civilian men, they started to secretly train them, specifically on how to hide and transmit information, how to move undetected, and how to resist interrogation. Their goal wasn't necessarily to fight as soldiers or to be, ninjas. Their goal was to simply act as civilians, and if there was a Soviet occupation that took place within Alaska, they could be working as secret agents behind enemy lines, and the Soviets would be none the wiser. I can only imagine how cool it would be to be like a hunter in Alaska, and then you get approached by the FBI and they're like, hey, do you want us to train you how to be a spy for the US government? Obviously, the Soviets never had an occupation in Alaska, but that doesn't mean that the United States wasn't prepared for it. All of these men that were trained by the FBI had to keep all of this a secret from their family. And this entire operation was a secret until the early 2010s, when the Operation Washtub document was declassified, and the world got to know exactly how sneaky the Americans can be. And honestly, I think this is a pretty genius operation. Project TMB. Did you know that the FBI once planned on assassinating popular YouTuber Trust Me Bro? Wait, what is this? Wait, sorry, I'm just reading this document live right now. The FBI said that the only way that they would not eliminate Trusty Bro is if Trusty Bro hit 1 million subscribers in the year 2025, and that his subscribers considered checking him out on Twitter and Instagram, just in case anything happened to his YouTube channel. Guys, this is a crazy declassified document, and it's probably best we take it seriously. For the sake of me and the channel, if you like our content, consider subscribing. And I've never mentioned our other socials before, but I have a Twitter that's pretty inactive, but it's there, and I have an Instagram that we post pretty regularly on. So if you're a fan of the channel, check it out. Because as of right now, the FBI is not on our side. And trust me, your subscription and follow might just save my flat 2D butt. The FBI tracking Aretha Franklin. Honestly, the title of this one kind of says it all. The FBI was tracking the Queen of Soul, Aretha Franklin, not for a little bit, but for over 40 years, according to declassified documents. Aretha Franklin was a famous singer of soul music and had no known criminal record. But that didn't stop the FBI from having a 270-page document about Franklin, on top of tracking her movements, all of her affiliations, and even scrubbing the lyrics from all of her songs just to get any information they could find. Why were they doing this? Well, because Aretha Franklin was an African-American singer, and she was involved with civil rights activism, something that the FBI was closely monitoring. One of the biggest reasons why the FBI was tracking Aretha Franklin was because she was very close to Martin Luther King Jr. She would perform at rallies, speak during protests, and was seen as an influential civil rights leader outside of just being a famous musician, which is why the FBI wanted to keep an eye on her. Basically, just because she was famous, black, and was outspoken about civil rights. And the FBI claimed that their main concern was that these sort of lyrics and speeches and movements could cause political unrest, which is interesting to say the least. And if you watched our last video about conspiracy theories, then you would know that Aretha Franklin was not the only person that was monitored by the FBI. There was an entire FBI operation known as COINTELPRO, which was dedicated to monitoring, gathering information, and even publicly discrediting and shaming people associated with either civil rights movements or communist movements. And this included a lot of famous people, including Martin Luther King Jr., John Lennon, Elvis Presley, Jimi Hendrix, Frank Sinatra, and many, many more. The files that the FBI kept on Aretha Franklin never showed that she did anything wrong. And the only thing that it really proved was that the FBI was willing to waste money to make sure that famous, rich, influential black people weren't saying anything that they didn't like. Operation Ajax. Operation Ajax was an operation led by the CIA, not the FBI. But it's worth talking about, so I'm going to mention it here, and was also in collaboration with the British intelligence agency MI6, a group you've probably heard of. Operation Ajax revolves around Iran, oil, and overthrown governments, and you can probably already see where this is going. During the 1950s, a certain man was gaining a lot of popularity in Iran, a man named Mohammad Mossadegh, and he became very popular and well-liked because he was able to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which essentially took the control of the oil production out of British hands, keeping the profit for the country of Iran. Something that citizens would obviously appreciate, but who didn't appreciate it was the British government, because they had just lost money and power. And because of this, Iran was becoming more and more anti-Western and nationalistic in their sentiments, at least according to Britain. And when Britain tried to retaliate on their own, they failed. And because of that, they turned to the United States asking for help. And their claim to the United States was, hey, Mossadegh is getting a lot of power in Iran, and he's also pretty left-leaning. And this might invite the Soviets into the region and cause a lot more communism than we want to deal with. And basically, the British government could have stopped at left-leaning because the US government was already in. Keep in mind, this is the 1950s, this is post-World War II, approaching Cold War era, but it doesn't even really matter what time it is because America is anti-communist and they were ready to rumble. Once the United States government joined forces with the British government, Project Ajax was fully underway. The ultimate goal of this collaboration was to remove Mossadegh from power and install new management in the country of Iran that were more to the liking of the British and American governments. Part of what the British and American governments ended up doing was creating massive propaganda campaigns within Iran, bribing Iranian officials, infiltrating the press to spread messages that were more aligned with what the British and Americans wanted, and organizing intentionally violent riots in the street of Iran so that they could blame it on Mossadegh's incompetent government. And with all of these tactics and others put together, the goal of making Mossadegh seem unfit worked. And it set the stage for the return of the previous political system they had prior to Mossadegh, which was monarchical control. And once all of the covert operations from the US and British government worked, the Iranian military themselves actually backed the pro-Shah factions that were emerging in Iran and forced Mossadegh out of power. At this point, with the power vacuum in full effect, the US and the UK installed their own preferred monarch, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And this installed ruler ruled as the autocratic monarch for the next 26 years, and coincidentally, during his time in power, had rather substantial support from the West. That was until 1979 when the Islamic Revolution happened. When all of this was going on, there was a lot of people that were suspicious that this coup that the US government was essentially subsidizing and taking part in was happening. But of course, the US government and the British government denied it for many, many years. But decades later, the files surrounding Operation Ajax became declassified, and the CIA formally acknowledged its role in this coup that they had orchestrated in Iran in the 1950s. But by that point, the damage was already done. To me, one of the craziest things about this was that Mossadegh was actually democratically elected, meaning that the people wanted him in there, and he was in power at the will of the citizens of Iran. And as democratic as the US and British governments claim to be, they definitely don't appear to be fans of democracy when it doesn't directly benefit them, which is interesting. And it just makes you think, was there a Red Scare there, or were they just wanting to get their oil money back? I'll leave that up for you to decide. The CIA's insectocopter. In case insectocopter is a word you've never heard before, let me explain what it is. It's an insect helicopter, and it's something that the CIA developed during the Cold War as an experiment in spy technology, and was specifically one of the earliest attempts at biomimicry surveillance. Truthfully, this instrument is pretty cool and also pretty terrifying, because keep in mind, this is over 50 years ago when the CIA was able to create a pretty convincing looking dragonfly that had a miniature gas-powered engine equipped with an ultra lightweight microphone, meaning that it could fly on its own and just, record anything inconspicuously. And compared to alternatives that they were using at the time, this was completely unheard of and also revolutionary. Because now you don't need a huge drone that could be detected or a human in risky areas. You could literally just have a bug flying around. Nobody would be the wiser. However, even though the insectocopter looks extremely convincing, according to the CIA, they were never able to fully get it operational, and therefore it was never used. And this is because it was too affected by wind, the steering was too hard to control, and because of both of these factors, it was basically useless in any high pressure situation. And as a result, it was proof of concept and something they would likely put on the shelf. Keep in mind, this bug was created in the 1970s, and the declassification of it even existing didn't happen until 2003, when it was also placed in the CIA's museum for all to see, which is at least pretty cool. But it just makes you think, if over 50 years ago, the CIA was able to create a semi-operational, very lifelike looking dragonfly that was able to fly on its own and record, what do they have now? The declassified documents claimed it was never used, but is there another still classified document that claimed that they were able to make it work? Who knows? Or maybe the dragonfly didn't work, but the beetle worked. I don't know. It just makes you think. FBI memos of Hitler in Argentina. We all know that Hitler and Eva Braun both died in a bunker in Berlin in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. But not everybody believes that. Some people believe that Hitler survived the attack in Berlin and was able to make it to Argentina, where he lived out the rest of his life secretly. Now that is a conspiracy theory, and a pretty crazy one, but there is some interesting declassified files surrounding the situation. One notable file was a memo that was dated September 21st, 1945, which is only just a few months after the Second World War ended. This memo describes the documentation of an anonymous tip that the FBI received, claiming that Hitler had arrived in Argentina via a submarine and landed somewhere on the southern coast, and that the Argentinian government had prepared for his arrival and purposely sheltered him and other Nazi families in different areas across Argentina, basically putting them in dictator, genocidal, criminal protection. The memo specifically describes that Hitler was living in a heavily guarded area in the Andes with other high-ranking officers. And there are even reports claiming that Hitler shaved off his mustache, which, I mean, that's the least you could do if you're trying to be covert. Keep in mind, these are not facts. These are anonymous tips that the FBI just got, and they archived them and documented them, but didn't do much about them. And in the years following 1945, the FBI received more tips and letters of people saying similar things. But as a whole, they were just labeled as unsubstantiated and kept on record, but not necessarily acted on, as there was no real basis for the US government to do anything about them. And that's kind of where that FBI memo ends. And what I find really interesting is that the FBI got a lead about Bigfoot hair, and they took action and researched it, but they got a lead about Hitler potentially being alive, and they're like, nah. But I guess realistically, those are two different things, and it's one thing to set a hair for analysis, and it's another thing to try to look for a person in another country once you already know that they're dead. I guess that's kind of the distinction there. But what's interesting is that in 1955, 10 years later, the CIA actually sent agents to Argentina to confirm that Hitler wasn't in Argentina, because there was so many reports that they were getting from looking at the archived posts from the FBI in 1945, and also from more recent reports of people telling the CIA that they are confident that Hitler is alive and in South America. And while these declassified documents are definitely interesting, there is absolutely no proof or evidence that Hitler was ever in South America or didn't die in Berlin. And these declassified documents definitely gave the conspiracy theorists a great heyday when they were first declassified. But what do you think? To me, it's interesting that there is at least recorded documents of people claiming to see him in South America, but as far as proof, that's something we don't have. Crazy archaeological finds scientists can't explain. Big Costa Rican balls. It was the early 1930s, and the United Fruit Company was in Costa Rica clearing out parts of jungle to create room for banana plantations, as they were looking to expand their fruit empire. However, as workers who were clearing out the jungle only really expected to run into some trees, spiders, and worst case, large animals, what they actually ended up running into was a lot more unique. As these worksmen began to make sizable dents in the forest and began digging into the ground, they kept finding almost perfectly spherical stone balls. And these balls ranged in size, with some being only as small as a baseball and some of the largest being 9 feet in diameter. Most of these workers didn't think too much about these balls as they were focused on the mission. However, as these balls quickly became a massive obstacle, they decided to take a closer look at them. And they realized that these balls weren't just random rocks, they had to be man-made. And upon closer inspection, these workers believed that inside these stone balls had to be buried treasure. And while on the clock, they literally drilled holes into these balls and stuck dynamite in it, really just to see what was inside. But of course, they were disappointed when they found nothing but more stone inside these stones. And unfortunately, many of these big stone balls were destroyed before authorities were aware of what they had just discovered, something that would end up becoming an archaeological find that we still can't explain to this day. Only a year or so after the discovery of these balls in the early 1930s, archaeological missions began to further study what exactly these balls were, who made them, where they came from, and what their significance was. The daughter of an executive at the United Fruit Company, ironically named Doris Stone, began the first ever scientific investigation into these weird stone balls. And those investigations bred quite a bit of unique information. And from the mid to late 30s to early 1940s, Stone and her team continued their excavation. That was until they decided to stop. And for the most part, all research into these stones was also paused. That was until nearly 50 years later in the 1990s, when excavations and research started back up again, and they still continue to this very day. But with all of that being said, what exactly do we know about these random balls? Well, here are some quick facts. For starters, in Costa Rica alone, there is confirmed to be at least over 300 different spheres. And while it is not confirmed, it is believed that these spheres were created by an extinct indigenous culture of Costa Rica that flourished roughly from 700 to 1500 AD, known as the Declassified culture. Most of the balls themselves are made out of a coarse-grained stone similar to basalt. And according to archaeologists, it appears that these spheres were made from individuals hammering natural boulders against these large rocks, and then eventually polishing them with sand to create such a spherical shape. That basalt-like stone, known as gabbro, wasn't just found everywhere. It was actually only found in the hills of Costa Rica, typically several kilometers from where they were found. And it is believed, and actually almost proven, that the spheres were made in these hills and then rolled down the mountain, as archaeologists have found unfinished spheres still in the hills. And while this is important and interesting context, we still don't have all of the answers. And for the most part, everything I just said is unconfirmed besides what the stones are made out of and the size they are, which, like I mentioned previously, range from the size of a baseball to the size of a small car, with the heaviest one ever recorded being over 16 tons. But that still doesn't answer the question. What are these balls all about? And this is where archaeological theories range drastically. Some experts believe that these spheres were created to represent the solar system or potentially used as some sort of clock or celestial tracking system, while others believe that these rocks were simply created in honor of the sun and moon. But that's not all. Others believe that these balls were simply culturally significant, although for what reason remains unknown. And while I did give a rough timeline earlier, even that is still debated. Some scientists have dated the archaeological sites to go back as far as 300 AD, while others claim that it could be as recent as 1500 AD. And since there's no true way to date these rocks themselves, we really don't know exactly how old they are. However, the context clues of the surrounding indigenous tribes do give good context. But yeah, as of today, we still don't know what these stone spheres in Costa Rica mean. They are still actively being researched, although we may never know what their true purpose was. Regardless, these stone spheres have now become iconic in Costa Rica and have even become ingrained in part of their culture and tourism, meaning that while we may never know what they were originally intended for, they have, if nothing else, gained their own unique identity and purpose in the modern day. But with all of that being said, if you're ever in the jungle of Costa Rica and you see somebody in a red hat and red t-shirt asking you, do you want to see some cool balls? Make sure you confirm they're talking about the stone kind before you follow them behind some banana trees. Ancient lizard people. The year is 1919. Henry R.H. Hall, an English Egyptologist and historian, is in modern-day Iraq conducting the earliest large excavation of an area known as Tel al-Ubaid. This excavation was quite interesting and quite significant for multiple reasons. For starters, Tel al-Ubaid was able to prove that ancient Mesopotamian civilization predated what historians believed to originally be the start of civilization by thousands of years. The archaeological and scientific community more or less had their world rocked when they were finding evidence of civilization that dated back all the way to 6500 BC, nearly 3,000 years before what was originally thought to be the beginning of civilization. And while that discovery in itself is amazing and mind-boggling, it's not quite unexplained. However, some of the other discoveries from Tel al-Ubaid definitely are, with one of the most notable being the lizard people statues. Off the bat, like I was mentioning, the timeline significance of these artifacts are insane, because as I mentioned, these artifacts are from the Ubaid period, which is believed to be one of the earliest stages of Mesopotamian civilization, and actually predates the rise of Sumerian city-states, which in itself is extremely notable. However, one of the more glaring details about these figurines is the fact that they don't quite represent any one thing. They appear to have a humanoid body, although the head of these statues are unmistakably lizard-like or reptilian. And it's that one detail alone that has sparked so much controversy and so many theories on what these statues could have possibly meant. The statues themselves are actually only made of clay and are typically anywhere from 1 to 5 inches tall. And impressively, these small clay structures, as I've alluded to, have literally survived over 7,000 years of history, which in itself is impressive enough. Although, it doesn't answer the mystery. Many of these statues that were found depict a female body, some of which even demonstrating a child breastfeeding on this reptilian creature. And while some male examples of these statues exist, most of the examples found do represent women. Although the gender of these reptilians is hardly the most distinguishing factor, as their head really paints an interesting picture. These statues appear to have some sort of large, elongated snout, thin, slit-like eyes, and similar slit-like nostrils. But interestingly, on top of just having that sort of classic reptilian shape, they also have elongated skulls. Some of these statues also carry accessories, depicting these creatures wearing clothes, jewelry, and some even holding scepters or staffs, only adding to the mystery. And that mystery has bred countless crazy theories, with some being more out there than others. One of the most tame and cute theories about these sculptures is the belief that these are simply just children's toys that were made in ancient times and they are not to be taken seriously whatsoever. And while that's funny and I guess not completely impossible, it's important to understand that the context in which these sculptures were found. It's been reported that these sculptures were found alongside pottery, tools, and other ritual objects, meaning that there's strong reason to believe that this sculpture had some sort of cultural or religious significance. And while that doesn't debunk the ancient toy theory, I don't think it helps it. Other experts believe that these statues do have significance, but they are more symbolic, not actually representing any one true creature, and that school of thought has also bred the hypothesis of these sculptures potentially representing deities that these ancient peoples worshipped. Although, once again, your guess is as good as mine on how accurate that may or may not be. However, one of the most out there theories that isn't not believed is the hypothesis that these statues must represent alien life. And it's believed by some that ancient peoples around this time were visited by aliens to help jumpstart civilization. And they used the establishment of the Mesopotamian and Sumerian civilizations that followed this discovery as part of their reasoning. Regardless, whether or not you believe that these statues represent ancient aliens that visited us to help jumpstart civilization, or whether you believe these were simply children's toys that stood the test of time, the one thing that we can all agree on is that we simply do not know what these statues are supposed to represent. And unfortunately, we might not ever know, making the mystery that much more tempting and the theories that much more interesting. The Skeleton Lake. Hidden high in the Himalayas lies a mysterious lake known as the Skeleton Lake. This lake exists at over 5,000 meters above sea level. And prior to the 1900s, this lake was simply a lake that existed in a rural part of India. However, in the early 1900s, and most notably in the 1940s, this lake went from being a beautiful hidden gem in the Himalayas to being a real-life horror story, essentially overnight. The year is 1942, and a British forest ranger is doing a mission in the Indian Himalayas. During this mission, he finds himself at Rupkund Lake, a small but notable lake hidden well above sea level in the Himalayan mountain range. This lake on its own, while interesting, is not very notable. It's only roughly 40 meters wide, and for a majority of the year, it's frozen, meaning that it's hard to even tell it's there. However, during this fateful day that this British forest ranger was taking this mission, the lake was very much so not frozen. And while the draw of a lake hidden high in the mountains is likely undeniable, almost forcing you to walk closer to it and to look directly into it, what this forest ranger saw in the lake was definitely not what he was expecting. As this ranger approached the lake, he quickly noticed that what he was walking on was not simply scattered sticks amongst the rocks in the mountain. What he was walking on was bone, and the skull that he saw floating in the water only confirmed that fact. But it wasn't just one skull or a few bones that this park ranger ran into. This forest ranger had just stumbled upon the gravesite of nearly 800 people, with all of their bones being above ground and scattered all over the place. And obviously, this discovery sparked concern and resulted in a massive investigation, one that is still going on to this very day. And while in that time we have definitely learned a lot about these nearly 800 dead bodies, there are still so many unanswered questions, making this entire discovery and location simply so mysterious. One of the most interesting pieces of information we have in regards to these bones is the fact that they belonged to a wide variety of people, ranging anywhere from elderly women to young boys and everything in between. Due to this fact, archaeologists believe that these bodies had nothing to do with any sort of battle or war, simply because typically mass graves related to war consist only of adult men, and this group was definitely not that. But a fact that is undoubtedly more notable and more shocking than that is the fact that these nearly 800 bodies did not consist of one large group that experienced one massive tragedy. and scientists and archaeologists believe that there is 3 distinct groups that all experienced some sort of unfortunate fate on the top of this mountain, all within a 1,000-year span. One of the first confirmed groups to have been found at Rupkan Lake was a group of South Asian individuals that were believed to be from roughly 800 AD. Another, interestingly singular skeleton showed signs of having East Asian genetic markers with no exact date being identified with it. And most interestingly, the third most distinct group identified at this lake was a group of individuals from the Mediterranean that likely died in the 19th century, making the mystery of that lake so much deeper. But unfortunately, the mystery that this lake holds may never be discovered, and that's simply because of human intervention. Over the years, this lake has become notorious for hikers, tourists, and travelers, and as a result, many of these bones have been disturbed, artifacts have been broken or stolen, and as a result, archaeologists are left with less and less context and information to be able to piece together a story about exactly what happened at this lake. Meaning that once again, we don't know and may never know what happened to these individuals. Although there are some theories. One of the most common theories is that at least one of the groups had succumbed to a massive hailstorm, resulting in massive blunt force trauma to the heads of these travelers. And while there are many skulls that show blunt force trauma, this theory is nowhere near confirmed, although hail isn't uncommon in this part of the Himalayas. But while that may be a reasonable explanation for one of the groups, it definitely doesn't explain all of them. But even if it did, there are still so many more unanswered questions. Who are these groups of people truly? Why were they all in the same area? And how did they all meet their fate in this one specific location? While over the last 80 years, scientists have been able to make massive leaps and bounds in terms of discovery, the reality of this situation is that unfortunately, we may never know the horrific history of this lonesome lake hidden high in the Himalayas, the Trustworthy Bros. It has long been understood that Trust Me Bro on YouTube posts funny, high-quality videos every single Friday. However, surprisingly, nearly 65% of the people that watch Trust Me Bros videos are not subscribed. And this mystery has stumped experts for decades. However, if you are not subscribed and enjoying this video and want to help solve this mystery, definitely subscribe and leave a like on this video. Jokes aside, I've been having a ton of fun with this topic, so if you guys want more videos about crazy archaeological finds that have not been discovered, please leave a like or leave a comment below saying part 2. I do my best to make the videos that you guys want, so let your voice be heard, leave a comment below, and with that, let's move on. The Lost Chinese Kingdom. The year is 1929, and a Chinese farmer in Sichuan, China, is digging on a part of his land that is yet to be developed. However, while digging on this land, he finds something interesting. It's a jade artifact. However, it's not the only one he's going to find. And over the course of an hour of digging, he finds multiple jade and gold artifacts. However, while this discovery was notable, it barely scratches the surface on what was going to be found in this area. To this farmer, he just found a few goodies he could retire with. However, to the archaeologists who are later going to excavate this entire area, this site would mean a lot more than just a few dollars, and would eventually result in the discovery of a Chinese kingdom that had never before been seen. Following the discovery of these jade artifacts in 1929 by the farmer, things went relatively quiet. That was until the 1980s, when the site was revisited and examined in a large-scale excavation. And what these archaeologists found back in the 80s was absolutely insane. On top of the typical gold and jade and stone artifacts, they also found massive and complicated bronze structures. Structures that didn't match the creations of any known kingdom at the time. They found sculptures that appeared to look like lampposts, and most notably, they found caricatures of faces that had proportions that were alien-like to say the least. And once again, they were not consistent with any sort of art or creation of any kind from any known Bronze Age Chinese civilization, making these unique artifacts now mysterious artifacts. The archaeological site where these artifacts were found is known as Sanjinghui, and it is also that name that was given to the mysterious culture that existed at the time. Interestingly, the two archaeological sites that were dug up in the 1980s were believed to be sacrificial pits. And this is because many of the artifacts that were found in these pits were essentially collected in piles and buried. And many of these artifacts showed signs of burn damage, meaning that they were likely attempted to be destroyed at least at some point, only further adding to the mystery. During the Bronze Age, the only two primary civilizations that were known to have such large bronze structures in terms of masks, statues, and ritualistic objects were the Egyptians and the Greeks. And the discovery of Sanjinghui was a first for China, because previously they were not in the conversation for massive bronze artifacts being created in the Bronze Age. However, now there is undeniable evidence that they were very much so participating in the creation of massive bronze structures. And while that fact is interesting enough on its own, it's only the tip of the iceberg, because there is still so much more that is unexplained. What exactly did these sculptures represent? Who were these alien-like people? What were these masks used for? Were they ritualistic? Were they religious? Were they spiritual? And most importantly, who made them and why? And unsurprisingly, the answer is unclear. To this day, multiple archaeological sites remain active, consistently trying to discover the mysteries hidden in these sites. However, most of the things that are found only breed more questions than answers. One of the most notable artifacts, at least in my opinion, are some of these alien masks that were found not only made out of bronze, but made out of bronze and then coated in gold. And the reason why this is significant is because during this time, China was not known for its usage of gold, especially when it came to artifacts like this. However, at this time, the Greeks and the Egyptians were very known for using their gold, which makes you think, was there simply some linear thinking going on, or was there some sort of communication we had no idea about? And while personally I think this leans more towards linear thinking simply because these were only a few artifacts, and the chances of communication about something so trivial at this time are low, it's not impossible. At this point, the only thing that we truly know about Sanxing Shui is the fact that they existed roughly 3,000 years ago and they were expert craftsmen when it came to bronze, something that previously wasn't associated with ancient Bronze Age China. And while most of the important questions about the civilization are still unknown and may remain that way forever, while we do lack information, what we have gained from these archaeological discoveries is invaluable. Just look at all of these examples on screen of some of the insane bronze sculptures that have not only been unearthed, but put together and perfectly preserved in a museum that was built not far from the original archaeological site itself. There is giant alien-like faces, tall, skinny statues of people, even a massive statue that represents birds in a tree, and simply so much more. It's almost mind-boggling to think that such an advanced, technologically gifted civilization was able to simply have its entire history and legacy be left out of history books. However, at least in the modern day, archaeologists and historians are doing their absolute best to try to piece back together the story that was unfortunately never told. At least, not fully. Because there is actually a very famous artifact to come out of Sanxing Shui in the Forgotten Civilization. And that is this, a pottery pig that was found in 2020. And if you grew up playing iPhone games, then you know what this looks like. This is literally a pig from Angry Birds. And that is pretty awesome. And who knows, maybe this lost ancient civilization was playing an ancient version of Angry Birds, where they threw bronze birds at stone pigs. But that's just a theory, a bro theory. The Palpa geoglyphs. Many people watching this video, potentially including yourself, are likely familiar with the Nazca lines in Peru. These Nazca lines are a set of nearly 300 different massive figures etched into the desert sands of Peru. These lines or geoglyphs cover an area of over 1,000 square kilometers. And within that area, like I mentioned, are 300 different figures, most of which being animals, and some of which being almost 9 kilometers long. Those lines and geoglyphs are so interesting and so amazing in their own right. However, in my opinion, they're pretty well known, which is why I wanted to further discuss a niche subsect of the Nazca lines known as the Palpa geoglyphs. As they exist in the same area and are believed to be roughly the same age, the subject matter of the Palpa geoglyphs are a lot more peculiar than just a big spider. Although, admittedly, the Nazca lines and Palpa geoglyphs are pretty intertwined, so I'll be talking about them relatively interchangeably, at least when it comes to history. For a bit of context, the lines and geoglyphs are believed to have been created anywhere from 500 BC to 500 AD, already putting a pretty big question mark on when exactly these geoglyphs were made. The geoglyphs themselves are extremely simple in nature and were actually just created by moving rocks and stones out of the way of the desert to expose the colorful sand below. And the result was, of course, the now famous lines and geoglyphs we know today. And interestingly, these lines have been able to survive for thousands of years, relatively untouched, simply because this area of Peru experiences such little rain and such little wind that there has been almost no erosion to any of these creations, which is pretty interesting and fortunate. And it almost makes you wonder whether or not they knew this was the perfect place, or if they, let's say, just created these everywhere and these geoglyphs were simply the only ones that survived. But that's kind of off topic. The Nazca lines, unsurprisingly, are believed to be created by the Nazca people, and the most commonly associated meaning with all of these massive geoglyphs are simply religious significance, and that's almost as far as the understanding goes. However, while the Nazca lines may have religious significance in the form of a giant monkey or a giant spider, the Palpa geoglyphs have a much different and, in my opinion, more interesting purpose, at least potentially. And that's because the Palpa geoglyphs differ rather significantly. And included in the Palpa geoglyphs are human-like figures wearing crowns and helmets. And potentially one of the most notable geoglyphs out of the Palpa geoglyphs is a geoglyph that literally looks like a sundial. And because of this, some experts believe that these Palpa geoglyphs had some purpose or function when it came to tracking the sun, studying the skies, and potentially even more complex timekeeping and astronomy. The Nazca lines themselves, in my opinion, are already amazing and mysterious as is. But after learning about the Palpa geoglyphs, it almost seems like the Nazca lines had its own twisted spin-off show. Or maybe somebody who was working on the Nazca lines decided that they wanted to go make their own more interesting geoglyphs. But whatever the case may be, like everything else in this video, we don't know. And unfortunately, we may never know. All we are left with is the remnants of what was once something. And of course, the mystery and mission of trying to figure out what exactly that was. And while everything I've discussed in this video is cool, and the mystery definitely adds a layer of coolness to it, in my opinion, I hope at least at some point all of these mysteries become solved, because I would truly love to know the detailed history about each of these examples. What happened to the people at the lake in India? Who built those massive balls in Costa Rica and why? Why were they making lizard people figurines 7,000 years ago? And why were the Peruvians building such massive sundials and animal carvings in the ground in the desert? Were they simply trying to appease the sun god? Were the aliens using the Peruvian desert as some sort of etch-a-sketch? The reality is, we may never know. The craziest cave rescue missions ever. If you're anything like me, then you guys have spent a lot of time at 2 a.m. watching YouTube. And for some reason, we all end up in the same rabbit hole, watching those insane caving videos. You know, the guys with loving families at home who just decide that they need to shove themselves through 2-inch cracks, 100 feet under the ground, while half underwater and covered in spiders. And at this point, it's even a meme to make fun of these crazy cave people. All over TikTok, people are just putting shoes over cracks and being like, oh, look at me, I'm a caver, which is honestly hilarious. But in this video, we're going deep, no pun intended. Today, we're discussing rescue missions, but I'm putting a twist on this video. These rescue missions could either be successful or unsuccessful, and you won't know the outcome until the end of the story. So buckle up and don't get too attached to the characters in these stories. Let's begin. Thunder Canyon. This story gets seriously intense and involves a software engineer who went on a cave expedition with an experienced group and ended up fighting for his life. Brent Colvin is a 39-year-old software engineer from Valley Center, California. And due to the fact that he was an engineer, he was a very meticulous planner, especially when it came to planning unique adventures. And his trip to Thunder Canyon was no different. It's important to note that Brent is not an unexperienced caver and has been caving for years and is considered by many an intermediate to advanced caver. And the group of cavers he was about to embark on this expedition on were even more experienced than him. Thunder Canyon is a legendary cave for a few reasons. For starters, it's extremely elusive and is not marked anywhere, and it's only known within the caving community, and even learning the coordinates or general location of this cave system is more or less of a privilege. That aura for a lot of cavers already is so enticing, but it doesn't end there. The cave itself is dynamic. It's deep, dark, open in some places, wet in some places, tight in some places, and it almost sounds like I'm not describing a cave, but trust me, I am. Personally, it's hard to imagine a cave seeming enticing. However, if caving is your thing, Thunder Canyon had everything you wanted. It was rare, unique, and there was also many ways to approach it, as there was multiple entrances and exits that have been mapped out by other cavers. On Sunday, May 3rd, 2010, Brian and 6 other experienced cavers found themselves en route to Thunder Canyon, which included a short drive down an abandoned dirt road, and then from there a 2-mile hike to even get close to one of the elusive entrances to Thunder Canyon. After doing some searching, they find one of the entrances at 11 a.m. and the excursion begins. Upon entering this cave, they descend, and shortly after, without a hitch, the entire team clears the first obstacle. However, after this first rappel was a much larger task. It was an 80-foot drop. Now, it's important to note that this isn't just a rappel either. This rappel is a descent into darkness, going through through a literal underground waterfall that lands you into a underground puddle of almost freezing cold water. But for cavers, this is all part of the thrill. The guide, Luca, is the first to rappel, and shortly after, the other cavers rappel as well, until they are all safely at their first checkpoint. At this point, it was obvious that some of the cavers were already feeling the pressure of what this cave was about to bring, and the guide even gave everybody an out, saying it's only going to get worse from here, and if you want to get out now. There was about to be tight squeezes, it's only going to get colder, and the trip has just begun. But even with some unsure faces, everybody continued on the journey. After completing a few rooms and rappelling twice more, the group meets their first fissure, aka one of these claustrophobic holes, which was literally named the Terrible Traverse. And it's called that because it takes a right angle into a 9-inch wide crack. A gap so tight that you can't even turn your head. And not only is it tight, the gap is also deep. 200 feet deep from top to bottom. It's important to note that the group reached this fissure at 3 p.m., 4 hours into their caving journey. And this fissure was one of the last things standing in their way before they were at the exit of the planned route. And it was, of course, at this fissure where everything was going to take a terrible turn. The guide of this expedition goes through this crack first, without a hitch. He's done it many times. Next up, one of the least experienced cavers goes through this gap, and he, unfortunately, gets stuck. And not only does he get stuck, but he panics. He had never been pinned like this before and was freaking out, and none of the other cavers were going to be able to help him until he calmed down. However, within 5 minutes, the guide was able to calm him down, and within 10 minutes, the guide and the other cavers were able to pull him through and assist him out of the cave. After that slight hiccup, 3 other cavers in your party make it through this fissure, and it's at that point when the guide takes all of the other cavers out of the group, leaving Brent to cross this fissure all by himself. A reasonable decision because Brent was an experienced caver and had experience in this specific cave. However, Brent hadn't experienced the Terrible Traverse, and this experience would be one that he would never forget. It's important to note that Brent was very nervous about trying this gap, and he didn't even know that the guide had left with the other cavers. So it was simply just Brent and his final buddy behind him in the cave. Regardless, Brent began moving through the Terrible Traverse. One of the biggest challenges associated with this fissure is the fact that you're not just walking through a gap or crawling through a gap. You have to move feet first down the length of the crack, and then angle your body sideways to shimmy along before dropping down a 5-foot gap where you could then get your footing and squeeze through to the exit. Just to be extra cautious, Brent removed his wetsuit to ensure he had as much space as possible. However, after inserting his body fully into this fissure, he was almost instantly stuck. He could feel the tension of the rocks on his chest. His hips were wedged between the walls, and the only thing supporting his body was his hand. He couldn't move in any direction, and it was at that point when he realized he was stuck. After being stuck for what felt like an eternity, the guide returned, only to notice Brent was stuck. And after 2 hours of their best efforts, Brent was no closer to being free and was actually beginning to slip deeper and deeper down this fissure. Due to the stress of believing that he would not make it out alive, Brent became rather lucid. And the final caver behind him, James, was simply telling him stories to try to keep him awake and conscious. And it wasn't until 6:40 p.m., almost 4 hours later, that the San Bernardino Mountain Rescue Team was actually notified and mobilized to the position. After 7 hours of Brent being stuck, the guide was signaling to a rescue helicopter that was sent, as the initial rescue team that showed up was simply not equipped to help Brent. And although the helicopter spotted them and help was on the way, it took an additional 4 hours for the helicopter to find a safe place to land and the specialized team to get on site. At this point, there was a very real risk of hypothermia for Brent and compartment syndrome, which is essentially when your chest is compressed for a long period of time, exposing you to the risk of cardiac arrest. Brent dying in his stuck position was a very real situation, and was only becoming more and more likely as more time passed. Once the rescue team finally was able to reach Brent within the cave, they explained exactly how severe the situation was. And their first order of business was keeping him as warm as possible, as he had no wetsuit on and his body was trapped between 2 rocks that were much colder than his body temperature, essentially drawing heat out of his body. The rescuers put heat packs around Brent and even gave him an electrolyte beverage. But with Brent and the final caver, at this point hypothermic, the rescuers had to move quick to save these individuals. As the rescue team began to attempt to move Brent, it was obvious that this was going to be a painful experience, as his ribs were tightly wedged between 2 rocks. And as they began pulling at his feet, Brent was screaming in pain, and the rescue team even asked Brent if they should stop pulling him, and it's reported that Brent literally replied, "I don't care if you break my ribs, just get me out of here." The rescuers used as much leverage as possible to lift the wooden board that bridged the gap in this fissure that was supporting Brent, and they used anchors to try to lift his body to pull him out. And with many failed attempts, they were able to move him 1, 2, 3 inches until they had him in a spot where their only option was to begin pulling his feet and essentially yanking him out of this cave. Brent's condition deteriorated deeper and deeper, and at 3:40 a.m., nearly 15 hours after entering the cave, Brent was pulled free out of the cave and rescued. After Brent was led out of the cave, the final caver quickly squeezed through the fissure without an issue, and the entire team survived this expedition. And after everything was said and done, it took over 13 people to help rescue Brent. I thought I'd start this video on a happy note. Yeah, Brent survived, fortunately. But I could not imagine what that experience would be like. And truthfully, I don't even want to paint a picture because I don't even want to imagine it. Being stuck sideways, dark, hypothermic, and lucid has to be just awful. And believe it or not, Brent promised himself that he would continue caving after this. Although he did say he would avoid tight squeezes, so at least there's that. At least he made it. But that might not be the case for this next story. The Peruvian Intimache Cave. Cecilio Lopez Tercero is a lifelong caver and adventure lover, and whether it be a natural talent or simply because of his lifelong experience and fascination, Cecilio had a very particular skill for navigating caves and squeezing through extremely tight gaps, seemingly with ease and almost no fear. He is a respected cave explorer, and at the time of this story, he is considered a veteran caver. Cecilio was even a member of the Madrid Rescue Group, meaning that he was more qualified than anybody, not only to save people, but also to explore caves safely. He was one of Spain's most renowned rescuers and cavers. Cecilio was Spanish, but due to his unique skills, he was taken on expeditions around the world to navigate caves that no one else would dare, and to map out caves that no one else could. I think you guys get the idea. This guy was a pro. Cecilio had heard of this obscure and rare cave system in the mountains of Peru through some of his colleagues. And when he learned that there was a potential for there to be never before seen artifacts or structures, he was instantly on board. And the expedition was set. And Cecilio and 9 of his colleagues began their expedition into the Intimache Cave in the Peruvian Andes. The Intimache Cave was reported to be at least a mile long and at least 1,200 feet deep. And Cecilio was curious how much deeper and longer it was and what secrets were hidden down in the bottom of this cave. Like any professional, Cecilio studied meticulously, learning of all of the risks associated with this cave. With the expedition underway, Cecilio led his group of colleagues into this cave on a multi-day expedition. And the first few days went on without any issues. Notes were taken, beautiful sights were seen, and everything was going to plan. But as they got deeper and deeper into the cave, the squeezes only got tighter, and the map only got more vague. After multiple days in this cave, the challenging physical aspect was obvious and accounted for, but the mental aspect was starting to take a toll as well, as these people at this point had been in complete darkness for days, only seeing the light of their headlamp. And the cave that they are hundreds of feet into is completely silent, only broken by the sounds of water dripping. It wasn't until what would have been one of the last days of the expedition that tragedy struck, and it was during a rappel portion of the cave. Cecilio was about to descend a modest 15 meters into the next room, known as the 13 days room. And it was at this point, after the anchor was set and he began rappelling, that he heard a cracking noise. His anchor had failed, and Cecilio was in a free fall, falling 15 meters onto hard rock. Cecilio somehow avoided all of the razor-sharp rocks covering the floor of this room. However, he lied there motionless, in extreme pain, and with a suspected broken back. After regaining consciousness, Cecilio came to the harsh reality of his situation. He lied helpless, deep in a cave that was already in an extremely remote and treacherous location, 400 miles away from Lima, Peru. He knew he needed to be rescued, but he also knew it was not going to be easy. One of Cecilio's colleagues carefully climbed down to where Cecilio was to assess the situation and realized how grim it was. One of the cavers in this party left to get help, and the others stayed with Cecilio to help monitor his health. Fortunately, Cecilio survived a fall that could have easily been fatal for some. However, now he has to survive what would likely be the most grueling days of his life, as after he fell and sustained these injuries, it would take almost a week for rescue personnel to make it to where Cecilio was. Keep in mind, Cecilio was in a deep, remote cave, located on the top of a mountain, where the entrance of the cave was at over 10,000 feet in altitude. When this medical team finally was able to find the location of the cave, hike over 10,000 feet to the cave entrance, and then begin the wild journey to where Cecilio was in the bottom of this extremely advanced cave, they weren't even there to help him escape. They were simply there to provide comfort measures and assess his health. They built a makeshift base camp and began administering morphine to provide comfort to the injured man that the medical team didn't know if they'd be bringing out dead or alive. Because Cecilio was still alive, removing him was going to be an extremely complicated feat, and it couldn't simply drag him by his feet, and he, unable to feel his legs, was unable to help himself as well. The medical team brought a rigid stretcher that was specifically designed to help carefully drag Cecilio out without jolting or repositioning his body, risking injuring him even worse. With medical measures in place, it was up to the other cavers to request specialized help. And initially, the Spanish government was unwilling to send a rescue team, and then they turned to the Peruvian government, both of which who denied to send help to save Cecilio's life. Cecilio's colleagues did the only thing they could do. They reached out to the Madrid Caving Society and also turned to social media, begging for support to help save their dear friend's life. They did everything they could to pressure the Spanish government into saving one of their most valuable cavers. Now, this is where things get interesting. Once some of Cecilio's friends from back home caught news of this, they immediately flew to Peru to help save them themselves. That is real friendship. And by the time these amazing friends were on the scene, there was already a small village at this cave entrance, consisting of medical staff, rescuers, and volunteers. Don't forget, this cave entrance is extremely remote and over 10,000 feet in altitude. It's not an easy place to be. And once again, keep in mind that this cave is extremely advanced, and many of the volunteers and rescue personnel that were dispatched are simply not equipped for this level of cave. And it would be only more of a liability for them to even attempt to save Cecilio. By the time that this rescue mission was fully underway, there was volunteer cave experts from Spain, France, Mexico, Peru, and over 40 Peruvian fighter fighters and military personnel actively involved in the rescue of Cecilio. And yet, there was still major challenges that took place. These 40 people need to eat, drink, they need to communicate with others, meaning that all of the progress that they're able to make is delayed significantly due to their lack of supplies, only adding more and more complexity to this seemingly impossible rescue mission. With this global team of experts on site ready to help Cecilio, they began the exploration into the cave. And once they reached Cecilio, they even explained their plan to him and got his professional insight on the escape that they had planned. And then they built a base camp 900 feet into the cave and began to set a complex series of anchor points across the entire cave so that they could essentially hoist the stretcher with Cecilio on it without him taking much more damage. On the 12th day, when they began drawing the stretcher out of the deep cave, things took a turn for the worse, as on this day, winds were higher than normal. The weather was unfavorable, and rain was adding an entirely new level of complexity into this rescue mission. Despite the heavy winds, a rescue helicopter was able to take the freshly rescued Cecilio to the nearest hospital, where he was treated, and after many months of treatment, he amazingly made a full recovery. The case of Cecilio Lopez is literally insane, and honestly a bit heartwarming to see how passionate people were about saving this man's life, likely because of all of the lives that Cecilio impacted during his time as a rescuer himself. If it wasn't for nearly 50 people from across the globe, not to mention local volunteers and villagers in the area, Cecilio would have never made it out of this cave and simply would have died. Call it luck or call it karma, Cecilio had something or somebody watching over him. Cecilio is a gangster, and the story is a clear example of how resilient the human body and mind can be. But we still have one more to discuss: the Chilean miner rescue. This rescue mission is by far the most intense we've talked about on this list, and is likely one of the most intense cave rescue missions ever conducted. As the title suggests, this rescue mission isn't of cavers who went down a deep, crazy, uncharted cave. This rescue mission is rescuing miners working in a gold and copper mine. And unfortunately, what started as a regular day on the job ended up becoming a multi-month global affair. Let me explain. On August 5th, 2010, 33 miners entered the San Jose cave in Chile. But that night, none of these miners leave that cave. The San Jose cave is over 100 years old, and it stretches over 10 miles of confusing corridors. Some of these mine shafts go almost a mile deep into the ground. But for these miners, this was a normal day at work. And shortly after 2 a.m., a collapse had happened, leaving these miners trapped. The San Jose mine, which was owned by the San Esteban Mining Company, was known for its notoriously unsafe work conditions, and the company had reportedly even ignored warnings from the Chilean Safety Administration. And unfortunately, today was the day that what the Chilean government had warned about would happen. After hearing a huge rumbling noise and literally feeling the earth shake below them, these miners, unaware that they have just been trapped, decide that they should likely exit the cave to evaluate what just happened. And it's on their way out of the cave that these miners realize that there was collapse. And not only a small collapse, but a large collapse caused by a 45-story tall piece of diorite rock, blocking the only way in and out of the cave. This piece of diorite was almost 1 million tons and fell directly onto the mine shaft. Fortunately, leaving the mine wasn't the only option for these miners, as near the very bottom of the mine was a man-made room known as the refuge. And after realizing that they weren't leaving this mine, all of the miners gathered up and made their way to the refuge. The refuge is exactly how it sounds. It's an emergency shelter area. Fresh air is strategically pumped into this room from the surface and is also stocked with emergency food and medicine. This room was meant for this exact situation, and in this case is going to be the difference between life and death. Because the mine is so massive, men working near the very bottom of the cave still at this point were completely unaware of what happened, and one of the miners had to go down to inform them what had happened and bring them back up to the refuge. These 33 miners weren't just all mining together. They were all in different parts of the cave when this happened. However, they all survived the collapse, and it didn't take long for them to all be gathered up in the safest place in the cave. Some of the miners remember that the ventilation system that pumps fresh air into different parts of the cave is, by regulation, supposed to be large enough to carry a person. It also should have a ladder inside for situations like this. Unfortunately, after further inspection, it was discovered that these ladders were never installed, and that these air pipes were simply useless for escape. And in their opinion, they have no way of contacting the surface. And at that point, things look grim. During this collapse, there was actually one miner who was in a part of the cave that was above where the collapse was, meaning that he was able to escape. Making his way through ash and rubble, he was able to tell the site supervisors exactly what happened and begin what would end up being a multi-month-long rescue mission. Due to the remote nature of this cave and the lack of any cell service, it took over 5 hours from the collapse happening for any authorities to even be notified of the situation. Unlike the last one, the government was willing to help these people, and they sent a specialized team down the mine shaft to see exactly what was going on. The specialized team decided to take the ventilation shafts down into the mine because they are able to rappel down and do not require a ladder. Although roughly halfway down this ventilation shaft, it is made very obvious that these ventilation shafts were unstable due to the collapse and that they would not be a method of rescue. And on their way back up, some rescuers were almost lost in another smaller collapse that took place within one of the ventilation shafts. And those on the surface still don't even know if the people in the cave are alive or not. After the miners return to the refuge with grim news about the ventilation shaft, the group of miners begin to plan for the worst. And it's at that point when they begin rationing the very small amount of supplies they have, and also begin to set out a routine, as these experienced miners understand that this rescue, if at all possible, will not take days, but likely weeks or longer. While it may seem like these miners are creating their own little community underground, kind of like a fallout shelter, an entirely new city is popping up on the surface of this mine, consisting of concerned citizens, volunteers, and most importantly, family members of those stuck in the mine. After days being stuck in this mine, the miners are unsure if anybody is ever going to come save them, until a noise is heard, a faint drilling noise from above, and they realize that help is on the way, and that somebody is drilling into the mountain. The team drilling above correctly assume that the surviving miners are going to be residing in the refuge, and it's for that reason that they aim a drill from the surface directly to the refuge, and a new challenge appears, accurately setting up the drill to ensure that it reaches the refuge, because even being a percentage of a percent off on the surface, by the time they reach the depth of the refuge could be multiple feet off, meaning that they need to completely reset and re-drill once again. To ensure that this rescue mission goes as smoothly as possible, the Chilean government not only acquires the support of other larger mine rescue teams, but also contacts NASA for consultation to ensure that they are taking the best possible course of action. While a team of experts is ensuring that the drill is put in the perfect position, another group of rescuers try accessing the ventilation shafts once again to ensure that they are completely impossible to save the miners. And unfortunately, it's confirmed. And not only did they confirm that the ventilation shafts are useless, they also confirmed that the diorite rock is still moving. Meaning that not only was there a large cavern that the diorite rock fell from, creating a ton of unstable ground in the cavity that it left, but it also means that this large rock that is now blocking the path is also still unstable and moving, while only slightly. Unfortunately, the drilling isn't going much better. And at this point, the drill has bent and broken multiple times, and the rescue holes that they've started have been abandoned twice. And due to the discovery of the diorite rock moving, the primary entrance of the cave has been closed and sealed forever. Now meaning that the only way of saving these miners is by successfully digging a 2,000-foot hole that spans from the surface perfectly into the refuge without collapsing. At this point in the story, we are 14 days into these 33 men being trapped underground, and we are still only just getting started. The head of this rescue mission made an executive decision. They are not going to drill faster, but they're going to drill slower. They begin re-drilling, but turn the drill to half speed to ensure that the drill does not malfunction or break course, as accuracy in this situation is paramount. It's already been proven that trying to rush this drilling would only take longer due to all the possible and likely failures. And it's at this point when things get crazy. 17 days since the collapse, the slow drilling procedure has been semi-successful, and while the drill breaks through into something, they don't know what they had broken through to. And as they remove the drill to insert a camera to inspect where the drill ended up, they noticed that the drill had something attached to it. There was a note attached to it. a note from the miners below. They had contacted them, and to those above, this was the first confirmation that there was any living miners stuck in this cave. The letter described exactly where the drill had broken through in the mine, and also was a personal letter to members of the family from the miners, as they were still completely unsure if their fate was sealed or not. The last thing written on the note is the most important of all. It is a simple confirmation that all 33 miners are alive and well, and this brings the morale of all rescuers to an all-time high. But the job is still not over yet. Like, just think about it. Imagine 17 days ago, over 2 weeks ago, you are told that your family is dead in a mine and that your father, brother, uncle, cousin was in a gold mine that collapsed and that they are dead. And if the collapse didn't kill them, then being underground for 17 days definitely did. But then all of a sudden getting confirmation that not only your loved one, but everybody's loved one is alive in this mine. That has got to be the most intense roller coaster of emotions. Now that they have a hole that goes directly to the refuge, they drill 2 more. One for supplies and one that is intended to be used for rescue. The miners underground now have communication to the surface through a phone that was dropped down one of the supply holes. They have food, medicine, and water provided to them through one of these holes. And while things look amazing, they are still trapped underground. From day 17 till day 65, drilling continues to make a large enough hole to take people out of the refuge, and development continues on a pod that will be sent down this hole and retrieve these people. Essentially an elevator-like tube that can take one person at a time in and out of the cave. And on day 65, both of these new tools are put into place. There is a hole that is wide enough to take people in and out of the refuge, and an experimental device created by the Chilean Navy with support from NASA is ready to be tested. It's a metal tube that can be dropped and retrieved out of the cave, and it's now officially going to begin its first test run. A rescuer bravely enters this pod and descends down into the mine. Unsure if this pod will even make it down to the bottom of the mine safely, or even if it does make it safely, if it's able to go back up. However, a rescuer is required to descend with the pod to give proper instructions on how to safely use it and to give some support to those who have been underground at this point for 65 days. The first miner, who is already pre-selected by the group, enters the pod and makes his 15-minute journey up through the pod, and without a hitch, makes it to the surface successfully and safely. The first of these 33 miners to see the surface for over 2 months. Throughout the night, all 33 of these men were taken to the surface safely, where thousands of people stood by for the rescue and millions of people were watching worldwide on TV as this rescue was broadcasted globally. All of these men were deemed in good physical condition, and they were all instructed to wear sunglasses because they had been in essentially darkness for 2 months, and the sunlight could be harsh on their eyes. All of the men visited the hospital to ensure their vitals, and only 2 of them weren't instantly released. The 2 that weren't instantly released required either dental or some psychological help, both of which had those addressed successfully as well. This entire rescue mission was insane, and the fact that these men were able to survive for so long proves their mental and physical resilience. And I cannot imagine the feeling of finally reaching the surface after over 2 months underground to see so many people screaming and cheering and celebrating the success of your rescue. This entire rescue mission cost over $20 million, with the majority of that money coming from private donations. The story, once again, is such a heartwarming example of communities and people coming together to save those in need. And I really wanted to highlight that element specifically in this video, because a lot of videos on these topics don't do that. They focus on the negative, which I get. And I guess if you want your little bit of negativity, here's something that'll piss you off. Investigations that took place after the rescuers were saved determined that there was no criminal charges responsible to the mining company for this collapse that happened, even though it was known for its unsafe conditions. And while that's an entirely different story for a different video, it's something to ponder on. Many of these men were giving donations and gifts from wealthy people who sympathized with their situation, but these gifts did not allow them to retire, and these men had to make a living, most of them returning to mining, believe it or not. And I knew I had to add it on this list of crazy and insane rescue missions. And I think it goes to show, with enough media attention to get enough people and the right people involved, almost anything is possible. The richest people in human history. In the modern day, the position of world's richest person fluctuates pretty often, and these fluctuations are typically based off of stock price and other economic factors. And while it's interesting to talk about who the richest person in the modern day is, if you have an inquisitive mind, these thoughts may bring you to the question of who was the richest person in other time periods, and who was the richest person in human history. In this video, we're going to answer both of these questions and more, starting at the very beginning of human civilization, the Stone Age. It may serve as no surprise that because the Stone Age is, well, for the most part, prehistoric, we don't have any verifiable sources of wealthy individuals. That being said, that doesn't mean that we don't know what wealth looked like in the Stone Age, and for that reason, I wanted to at least quickly mention it. As I've mentioned in a few of our previous time period videos, wealth in the Stone Age was measured strictly in your ability to survive. And the things that granted your survival in the Stone Age were food, shelter, water, and community. And while those things may have no monetary value, in the Stone Age, being alive is a lot better than being dead with a pile of money. If you were rich in the Stone Age, you had a strong tribe around you. Your group consisted of strong, successful, ferocious hunters, attentive and expert gatherers, and passionate mothers taking care of the young. Humans in the Stone Age needed each other to survive, mainly because every aspect of life was work, and you can't do everything all by yourself. But in a tribe, tasks can be done by multiple people, allowing the group to survive. But outside of just tasks, the group also provided protection from natural predators, because in the Stone Age, humans weren't at the top of the food chain, and there was very much so natural predators that were wanting to eat you. But of course, community isn't the only thing that gave you wealth. Besides having this strong, tight-knit tribe, you also ensure that your tribe is located in a fruitful area of land. And what I mean by this is that hunting is bountiful. Animals consistently graze near your tribe, making hunting easy and consistent. But beyond just having a good location with consistent food and pelts, it's important that you have access to water, which is why you and your very wealthy tribe also have a perfectly clean stream going right beside your tribe's location. This stream provides your tribe not only with water, but also fish and transportation. But even with all of these Stone Age luxuries, there is still one more way that your tribe could have more wealth, and that is by having the best shelter possible. And in the Stone Age, one of the best options was a natural formation, typically a cave that provided shelter from storms and hot weather, consistent moderate temperatures, and once again, protection from natural predators. And while the bar may seem relatively low for the Stone Age, everything I just described was literally a dream come true. And if you happen to have all of these in your life, you were by far the wealthiest person to live. And by wealthiest, I just mean you were alive, because poverty in the Stone Age was literally just death. So even though our caveman ancestors didn't have much, and we can't verify who was the richest person at the time, it's at least interesting to understand what made a wealthy life during this time period, and it's also a good reminder that life is a blessing. The Bronze Age. No, not LeBron James, the Bronze Age, the time period that comes after the Stone Age. And luckily for us, we have verifiable evidence of who the richest person was during this time period. Wealth in the Bronze Age already looks worlds different than it did in the Stone Age. And that's because during the Bronze Age, human societal development really hit an exponential curve. And while the Stone Age literally went on for millions of years and only really yielded rudimentary structures and stone tools, the Bronze Age is where we really see society develop into small villages and also forging with metals. Most notably in this time period, bronze. With the development of society, culture, and tools, we now have a new definition of wealth. And fortunately, we also have documented history. However, I am using that term lightly because although we do have some texts referring to the reign and wealth of King Solomon, many of them came many years after his lifetime. So take some of these testimonies with a grain of salt. The year is 970 BC, and the kingdom of Israel is now under new management. King Solomon was the successor to his father, King David. It's estimated that King Solomon's rule ran from 970 BC to 931 BC. An impressive 39 years. And keep in mind, during this time period, even living to see 39 was an accomplishment. But longevity is not the point of this video, and what's even more impressive than his reign was his wealth. It's recorded that under the reign of King Solomon, his kingdom actually earned its highest splendor and wealth of all time, with record revenues reaching 666 talents of gold in a single year, which is an ironic number, but that equates to over 18,125 kilograms of gold earned in a single year. Keep in mind, the reason we're talking in precious metal volumes and not, well, dollar values is because during this time, money didn't even exist. Not even any form of coinage. Precious metals were truly the only store of value, meaning that gold was truly the gold standard. And for that reason, King Solomon got a lot of it. And how he got this gold may not be so much of a shock. As the king of a nation, Solomon's wealth primarily came through tax revenue. But on top of this massive tax revenue, he also earned money through trade alliances and also control over important trade routes that linked Africa, Asia, and Europe together. But like any good business mogul, he didn't end there. Solomon was also involved in mining, agriculture, and also building projects funded by the kingdom's resources itself, meaning that not only did he have a massive personal net worth, but he also had, well, basically infinite money at his expense through the wealth of the nation that he managed. And because of the prosperity that Solomon's kingdom saw during his long reign, it's estimated that King Solomon's net worth would be valued at anywhere from $2 to $3 trillion, which is insane. And since it's kind of variable, let's just average it at 2.5 trillion. Now, like I mentioned earlier, almost all of the information available about Solomon came from the Bible, which isn't an issue until you realize that Solomon lived and died hundreds of years before the Bible took place, essentially. So once again, for that reason, take this one with a grain of salt, but it's definitely an interesting first entry. And while we're on the topic of the Bible and interesting, not only did the Bible mention how wealthy King Solomon was, but they also mentioned how, well, promiscuous he was. And it's literally stated in the Bible that King Solomon had over 700 wives, and because that wasn't enough, he also had an additional 300 concubines, meaning that this dude literally not only had trillions of dollars, but also had 1,000 girls in his roster. The Iron Age. Interestingly, the Iron Age is not much different than the Bronze Age, and the brief period transitioning from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age was actually a pretty tumultuous time. And while that's kind of beyond the scope of this video, society essentially took 2 steps forward in the Bronze Age, and then 1 step back, and then 2 steps forward again into the Iron Age. And while once humanity sort of stabilized again within the Iron Age, it didn't look too different from the Bronze Age besides one key difference: the main metal at play, obviously being iron. But beyond the introduction of iron, we also see refinements and growth within the civilizations that were formed in the Bronze Age, or at least the ones that survived it. Consider that subtle foreshadowing. Now, once again, one of the richest people to ever exist, and most likely one of the richest people in all of the Iron Age, was a man known as King Croesus. And Croesus was the king of Lydia, a wealthy kingdom that existed in modern-day Turkey. Croesus had a relatively short reign, only reigning from 560 BC to 546 BC, roughly 14 years. But during this time, Croesus became an icon of wealth. And he was so rich, in fact, that the phrase, "as rich as Croesus," actually not only gained steam during his reign, but also existed for millennia after his death. But the story of Croesus and Lydia isn't all sunshine and rainbows, because although he did have immense wealth, his reign and life did eventually end up being cut short. But before we describe that, how exactly did he earn all this wealth? As a king, it may come as no surprise that Croesus' wealth was primarily earned through taxation, trade routes, and natural resources within the Kingdom of Lydia. Interestingly, in the Kingdom of Lydia, there was literally a river that was full of something known as electrum, which was essentially a naturally occurring alloy of silver and gold, which is pretty fortunate. But not only was Croesus known for being rich, but he also changed money forever. He actually started minting some of the world's first coins ever, standardizing the world's first gold and silver coins. And he did this so he could A, centralize his wealth, and B, strengthen the economy of his entire kingdom. And his idea of forming precious metal coins took off and spread across, eventually, the entire world. But as I mentioned, the story of Croesus is one of large wealth, but also one of large hubris. And it's claimed in ancient texts that it was the hubris of Croesus that led to his and his kingdom's eventual downfall. During Croesus' peak, the Kingdom of Lydia was rich, expanding, and even had alliances with Greek city-states. And Croesus himself was synonymous with wealth and power. And it's believed that because of all of this success and power, Croesus got a bit too confident, and this confidence caused him to challenge Cyrus the Great of Persia, Persia being another opposing empire at the time. Croesus felt confident that he could expand his empire and take on Persia, but first he made sure to contact an oracle, and it's written that this oracle that Croesus consulted prophesied that, quote, Croesus would destroy a great empire. And it's believed that Croesus interpreted this message as he had already won the war, so he could begin it and win with ease. Although the opposite was true, and the empire that Croesus would destroy was actually his own. And in 546 BC, Lydia fell to Persia, and it's believed that Croesus was either executed or spared and turned into an advisor for Cyrus. At the peak of his net worth, it's estimated that Croesus had roughly a net worth of $500 billion. Which, I mean, compared to the previous trillionaire, doesn't sound that much, but this net worth is still insanely impressive. And remember, like King Solomon, this wealth was not stored in cash, stocks, crypto. This money was in physical gold and silver. And dude had so much money and so much time that he literally decided to create coinage. I bet King Solomon would have created coinage too if he wasn't messing around with 1,000 women. The Classical Era. The Classical Era is where things begin to get really interesting because history is getting more and more documented and wealth is becoming more and more, well, common. That being said, when I had to choose one rich person to represent the Classical Era, the option was obvious, and it started with me thinking about one of the most iconic empires that existed during the Classical Era, that being the Roman Empire. And when you think of Roman Empire, who do you think of? Julius Caesar wouldn't have been a wrong answer. But believe it or not, Julius Caesar wasn't actually the richest Roman. However, who is regarded as one of the richest, if not the richest Roman, was his adopted son, Augustus Caesar. And Augustus Caesar was getting that bag. Augustus Caesar was born in 63 BC. And after winning probably the biggest lottery in all of human history, he was adopted by Julius Caesar, the infamous dictator of Rome at the time. Augustus was brought up surrounded by wealth, power, influence, and strategy, and truly learned the ropes from one of the most iconic people to ever live. That being said, when Julius Caesar was assassinated, there was a massive power vacuum, and Augustus had some major shoes to fill. However, he did exactly that. And not only did he rise to power through political skill, but he also formed strategic alliances and had numerous military victories under his belt. And because of this, at the relatively young age of only 36, Augustus Caesar actually officially formed the Roman Empire. If you're a fan of the channel, then you know that we've talked about the Roman Empire at length through our almost 100 videos. And ironically, my second video ever was actually a video about why the Roman Empire fell. And while that's outside the scope of the video, I thought I would mention it, because the Roman Empire has way more lore than I can summarize right now. Let's focus back in on Augustus. Following suit with other kings and leaders we've discussed so far, Augustus accumulated his massive wealth through the major expansion of the Roman territory, massive conquests, and the spoils of war. On top of this, having one of the strongest empires allowed him to have a steady stream of taxation, provincial revenues, and even tributes from conquered land. And conquer land he did. Augustus' fortune was tied to the control of land across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, which obviously just was the Roman Empire, but it's crazy to think the sheer scale of this entire place that he controlled. And interestingly, historians estimate that in today's money, the net worth of Augustus would be in the trillions of dollars, likely in the 3 to 4 trillion range. But this is largely because as the emperor of the Roman Empire, he essentially controlled and owned everything within it. Like, just imagine you're working at an Amazon warehouse and Jeff Bezos walks in and just starts taking stuff off the shelves. I mean, nobody's gonna stop him, and technically it's his, but at the same time, it's also the company's, and the lines really start to get blurred. Regardless, Augustus Caesar had an insane career, both politically and economically. And for that reason, he's not only remembered as the founder of the Roman Empire, the son of Julius Caesar, but also as one of the richest men to ever live, with a net worth of, let's say, $3 trillion. The medieval era. History is really heating up with the medieval era, and we are once again getting more and more interesting entries to this list and more data to verify some of these claims. That being said, we are still in the realm of estimation. Although in the medieval era, we have some very interesting estimates to discuss. And I want to start our medieval journey not in medieval Europe, but actually in the steppes of Mongolia. In the year 1162, a young boy named Temujin was born, and little did his family know Temujin would become one of the most famous and prolific people to ever live. And while this boy was named Temujin, you likely know him better as Genghis Khan, the same Genghis Khan that founded the Mongol Empire, which was the largest contiguous land empire in all of human history. And the wealth of Genghis Khan is actually quite different from the others we've discussed so far, and the others that we're going to discuss as well. Quite frankly, being the founder and ruler of one of the largest empires to ever exist, there is a very likely chance that Genghis Khan could have been the richest person in all of human history. However, there's a very important asterisk on that point. Genghis Khan was not one for personal wealth. And while the empire he was the sole heir to was extremely prosperous and rich in both land, resources, livestock, food, and army, Genghis himself did not store much value. He rather decided to invest back into the army to continue the expansion of the Mongolian Empire, which is likely a major contributing factor why the Mongolian Empire was so unstoppable for so long. Genghis ate, slept, lived, and dressed like a majority of his army. And while the actions done by Genghis Khan are, for the most part, deplorable, and the majority of his entire empire was funded by the pillaging and destruction of any other civilization they could, find essentially, it is still somewhat noble that Genghis decided to remain close to his modest roots and invest the wealth that his empire brought him back into his empire to further expand it. And while estimates for Genghis Khan's net worth range from anywhere from a few trillion to over 100 trillion, I would say that Genghis Khan's net worth is almost negligible considering how he viewed money. But because we need a number on this list, let's just call it 100 trillion in access, but maybe 100 400 billion in execution. You know, money he actually spent on his own personal lifestyle. And honestly, I think even that's a bit overinflated. The Mongolian people were extremely nomadic, meaning that storing wealth was not necessarily a convenient thing to do. And unless you're Steve from Minecraft, you probably can't store $100 trillion worth of gold in your back pocket. Since Genghis Khan was relatively a modest individual, even though he was likely one of the most powerful people to ever live, I wanted to add a secondary entry for the medieval era, someone you'll likely recognize if you're familiar with ancient, wealthy people. This next individual is a man known as Mansa Musa. And Mansa Musa, in many regards, is considered to be the most wealthy person to ever exist ever. Full stop. And while there's definitely an argument to back up that claim, we'll discuss how accurate that is at the end of the video. Mansa Musa ruled the Mali Empire from roughly 1312 AD to 1337 AD. And under the power of Mansa Musa, Mali was able to reach its peak power, influence, and wealth, controlling almost every key trade route across West Africa. But more notably, Musa's wealth came from the control of trade of salt and gold, which were extremely prevalent in West Africa at the time. But he didn't just profit off the trade of salt and gold. He also profited off the trade of ivory, slaves, spices, and other goods. Or should I say bads, because I don't think calling slaves goods is, well, good. He profited off goods and bads, okay? Regardless, Musa's net worth was immense, and it only grew when he took his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. It was this pilgrimage that not only grew his net worth, but also increased his international fame. Musa traveled with a massive 60,000 person entourage, and he did so because he needed many people to carry all of the gold that he was earning and traveling with. And because he was traveling with so much gold, he would actually just give it away at different cities he was stopping in. And because of this, in cities like Cairo in Egypt, the gold that Musa was just giving away for free actually disrupted local economies. But yeah, Musa was literally kitted out in full gold armor, all gold tools, had an army of 60,000 people in all gold armor, an additional 60,000 camels with all gold armor, an inventory full of gold blocks. This guy made Mr. T's neck look naked, but at least he was generous. So generous, in fact, that he literally caused inflation. But here's where things get interesting. While every number we've discussed is an estimate, the estimate for Mansa Musa is relatively modest, with a net worth believed to be roughly around $400 billion, which is still massive and more money than the richest person in 2025 has, although it's nowhere near the trillions we've discussed before. And after doing some research, I almost feel like Mansa Musa is known as the richest person to ever live simply because he was talked about so much in ancient texts, because this guy was just a G. If you saw a dude in all gold with 60,000 other gold people just giving out gold, I would probably believe that was the richest guy ever too. But that's not to discredit his legacy. The early modern era. Once again, there's so many good entries for this time period. We're doing a double feature. And we're starting with a man named Jacob Fugger. And Jacob Fugger is a real Fugger indeed. And that's because this man got so rich that he actually had more power over the kings in Europe. And that is saying something. Jacob Fugger was born into a wealthy family and started his career in the textile industry that his family was deeply invested in. Although it didn't take time for Jacob to realize that there was higher leverage opportunities out there. And he shifted his focus from being a merchant to being a bank for merchants. And with that, he made a massive fortune. And with that fortune, he got into some very interesting situations, specifically funding politicians to have power in parliament, and also by expanding his mining operation to create essentially a monopoly over the copper market in Europe. Jacob Fugger had so much money that he was literally known as Jacob Fugger the Rich. But he wasn't only known as a businessman. Like I mentioned, his career in politics made him known as a kingmaker, because he was giving out massive loans to Maximilian I and Charles V, both of which who ended up becoming massively powerful people within Europe. But Fugger wasn't only funding kings, he literally financed the creation of the Vatican. And to bankroll the construction of the Vatican, he actually started minting his own coins known as papal coins. And it was actually with Fugger's involvement with the Vatican that led to the eventual sale of indulgences, which was literally a ticket to heaven, which eventually sparked the entire Protestant Reformation. Regardless, Jacob Fugger was a very rich man. From textiles to mining to banker, Fugger did it all. And while he didn't do it all ethically, he did it. And it's estimated that his personal net worth was roughly 2% of Europe's GDP at the time, which would equate to roughly $400 billion in today's money. And interestingly, Jacob Fugger's net worth is one of the most provable net worths we've discussed so far, considering there are many records to validate these claims that are publicly available and, well, still exist. So even though 400 billion doesn't sound super impressive at this point in time, the power that he held as a non-royal was insane. And his net worth is likely one of the most accurate and non-inflated we've discussed so far. But like I mentioned, we got a double feature. So let's get that Fugger out of the way and discuss Akbar the Great. Akbar the Great was the third emperor of the Mughal Empire in India, and he ruled this empire from 1556 until his death in 1605. Interestingly, Akbar gained access to the throne at only 13 years old, when his father tragically died. And while giving a 13-year-old reign over an entire empire sounds like a horrible idea and has been proven to be multiple times throughout history, for Akbar, it actually worked out. It's almost like being a child actor. In most cases, it works out horribly, but sometimes it actually kind of does work out. His reign is remembered for vast land expansion, the flourishing of Indian culture, and strong central governance, which was largely missing at the time. And it was these primary contributing factors that made the Mughal Empire one of the wealthiest and most powerful states in the early modern era. The wealth that Akbar generated for the Mughal Empire was actually primarily driven by agriculture, as the lands of northern India were extremely fertile. But of course, in addition to this agriculture, he also made most of his money from taxation, both taxing those crops and other goods. On top of agriculture and taxation, once again, control of trade routes was a steady stream of income that allowed the Mughal Empire to grow and flourish. And due to this political success and economic growth, he ended up making the empire extremely rich, like 25% of the entire world's GDP rich, which equates to roughly $30 trillion in today's money. And unlike Genghis Khan, Akbar knew how to spend some money. He was known for his opulence, and so were his courtrooms and official government buildings. I wanted to add these two examples specifically for the early modern era because the examples are so vastly different, both in how they started their lives, acquired their wealth, and obviously the shocking difference in net worth between these two individuals. But keep in mind, for Akbar specifically, this 25% of global GDP is the wealth of the empire he controlled, not his personal wealth. And while that line was relatively blurred, even if we say he conservatively only paid himself 10% of that, we can estimate that his personal net worth was roughly around 3 trillion, although he had access to up to 30 trillion. So I'll let you be the judge of that. The modern era. Ladies and gentlemen, we have finally made it to the time period that we are currently existing in. With that being said, the modern era is considered to be from 1800 to today, meaning that we have a lot of ground to cover and many notable and documented individuals to discuss. So for that reason, I'm going to make this last time period a bit of a speed round. I want to first discuss Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man who lived from 1794 to 1877, and he was a man who was known as the first American business tycoon. And that he was. Vanderbilt built his fortune primarily through shipping routes and railroads, and he started his career as a ferry operator in the New York City harbor, where he was first exposed to commercial transportation, which later inspired him to start his focus on railroads and expansion across all of America. That being said, Vanderbilt wasn't necessarily a good guy, and he actually earned the name of robber baron as well, because he would typically use monopolistic strategies and market manipulation in his favor to buy railroads as cheaply as possible and extract the most value out of them. Regardless, Vanderbilt is known as one of the men that built America as we know it today, and the railroad systems that he established connecting U.S. cities and boosting American trade are still marveled at to this very day. At the time of his death, Vanderbilt's net worth was roughly $3 billion in today's money. And interestingly, when he died, he was worth more than the US Treasury. So even though $3 billion sounds puny in the video, within context, that number is massive. Cornelius died in 1877, and interestingly, in 1973, only 100 years later, it was found out that during a family reunion, there was not one single millionaire left in the family. That's right, the Vanderbilt family literally blew billions of dollars in less than 100 years through financial mismanagement and I'm sure other reasons. And besides Cornelius, another major player during the beginning of the modern era was a man known as John D. Rockefeller. And Rockefeller, he did. Rockefeller was one of the most prolific industrialists in American history, and he was the founder of the Standard Oil Company during the Industrial Revolution, a time when oil was an emerging market. And he was not only capitalizing on it, he was monopolizing on it. I think it's also important to note that during this time, business was nowhere near what it's like today. Like if you're complaining about modern day capitalism, then you should have seen 1800s capitalism. There was absolutely no regard for the environment, other business people, families, children, nothing. The Industrial Revolution was full of factories that had pregnant women and children working all day, with reckless disposal of industrial waste, and the most strong-arm, backstabby business tactics you've literally ever heard of. 1800s Industrial Revolution business was not for the faint of heart. And fortunately for Rockefeller, this was a game he was willing to play. When Rockefeller launched Standard Oil in 1870, he grew the company rapidly by essentially undercutting all of his competition. And then with the revenue he gained through undercutting this competition, he then bought out all of his competitors. And only 2 years after starting Standard Oil in 1872, there was a small few-month streak where Rockefeller bought 22 of the 26 oil refineries in Cleveland alone. And this purchasing streak was so impactful on Cleveland that it was literally known as the Cleveland Massacre. But Rockefeller didn't just undercut and buy every oil refinery he could. He also made sure to integrate vertically, controlling everything from the production, transportation, and sales of any oil product. And during the late 1870s, Standard Oil was literally refining over 90% of America's oil. And eventually, people were fed up with it. And I think in some cases, Rockefeller was truly seen as the first real example of true corporate greed, a symbol and theme that would continue until, well, today. Rockefeller's company, Standard Oil, got so big, in fact, that in 1911, the Supreme Court forced him to break up his company into 34 smaller companies, which he did, and ironically, this division only led to an increase of net worth for Rockefeller. Rockefeller was not a good guy, but there are a lot of things we use every single day that have been influenced from his work, and it was people like him that built the society we live in today, whether you like it or not. Rockefeller's net worth was estimated to be equivalent to almost 2% of all of the US's GDP, and he's also considered to be the world's first billionaire. And while there's definitely other honorable mentions from the beginning part of the modern era, like the Rothschilds and Henry Ford, I want to fast forward to the modern day to discuss some of the richest people in 2025, and also reflect on all of the rich people we've discussed and determine who is the richest of all. As of today, the world's richest man is largely believed to be Elon Musk. But besides Elon Musk, some other notable billionaires include Jeffrey Bezos, Bill Gates, and Bernard Arnault. And while I think most of us understand who these people are and how they made their money, I think it's important to reflect on how their net worths differ from people in the past. For example, you don't see Elon Musk storing all of his net worth in gold or taking a 60,000 person pilgrimage across Africa with gold armor on. A majority of his wealth is in shares, stocks, and is largely based off of the evaluation of the companies that he owns. Now, if we stack up Elon Musk's net worth of roughly $382 billion at the time of recording this video, he actually ranks relatively low in the context of this list. And for that reason, this video is about to get rather subjective, because to answer the question of who's the richest person in human history, there's a few different answers, at least in my opinion. If you want to base the ranking of history's richest person based off the numerical value, which, I mean, is logical, then I would say that honestly Genghis Khan has an extremely strong case for richest person ever. Although, if you want to base it off popular vote, there is a lot of people, for good reason, that believe that Mansa Musa was the richest person to ever walk this earth. However, if you're asking me who the richest person in all of human history is, genuinely, I would say that there has to be more factors beyond just wealth we consider. Because while Genghis Khan may have potentially had the most access to wealth, he personally wasn't extremely wealthy and also lived a lifestyle I have absolutely no interest in. And to be frank, I really don't have much interest in living any time before, I guess, 1990. The reason being, maybe I'm just spoiled, but I enjoy modern luxuries of today. And I would argue that somebody with a minimum wage job in America today lives a much better life than a king did in medieval times. Specifically because the technology, medicine, entertainment, and modern luxuries far outweigh any amount of gold, at least in my opinion. And I guess you have to ask yourself, do you want to be in a castle with a jester and a pile of unlimited gold? Or do you want a toilet that flushes, air conditioning, and access to YouTube to watch Trust Me Bro? That's the question. I'll let you decide in the comments. But if you're asking me who I think the richest person in all of human history is, I would definitely argue that Elon Musk takes the cake. Simply because his net worth is massive, he's the most prosperous man in the most prosperous era of human history, and he's also able to enjoy his money during the best time to ever live in human history, which is today, in my opinion.
If you're anything like me, you grew up playing Call of Duty. And one Call of Duty that always stood out specifically was Call of Duty World at War. This game was undoubtedly the catalyst for my fascination with the Second World War. And recently, while doing one of my late night History Channel binges, I came across some really interesting weapons. So in this video, I put together a list of some of the weirdest and most obscure weapons from World War II. Oh, and these are going to start weird, but get even weirder. First up, we have the Krummlauf, which is a German invention. The Krummlauf itself is not a weapon, but it is a weapon modifier. The Krummlauf is a barrel extension for rifles, similar to a suppressor, although this one was curved with a 30-degree angle. Although it seems like something out of Looney Tunes, the purpose was quite ingenious. The Krummlauf was used for close quarters combats in urban situations, specifically shooting around corners and over trenches. The Krummlauf wasn't typically blind fired, as it also had a periscope attached to it to also see around the corners. As useful as this item may appear, it wasn't extremely practical because it had a few major downsides, mainly accuracy and durability. The periscope, typically fastened with the Krummlauf, was very susceptible to fogging up, which left huge room for inaccuracy, and the Krummlauf itself was very susceptible to the immense forces behind a bullet, not only controlling the bullet but also redirecting that bullet, and they typically were only good for a maximum of 300 shots. Personally, I think the look of the Krummlauf is one of the weirdest things about it. I think the idea isn't bad, it's just wasn't able to be executed executed properly. The Krumov is weird, but there's definitely weirder, which is why it's only the first entry on this list. Next up, we have the V3 Supergun, and super it is. The V3 Supergun was developed as a so-called vengeance weapon in order to strike back at London as Allied bomber fleets pounded German cities to rubble. The V3 cannon was capable of delivering a 140 kilogram shell at a range of over 161 kilometers. But big deal, right? Wow, a cannon that could shoot a little bit further. What's so special? Well, one of the most unique attributes about the V3 Supergun is how it achieved this enormous range, and its unique engineering. The secret to this enormous range and what made this gun truly special was the number of side channels attached to the 140 meter long barrel. These channels were filled with additional propellant which would be triggered by the shell as it traveled through the long barrel. Essentially what would happen is the shell would trigger the propellant as it would fly down the barrel, which would cause the propellant to explode, giving even more velocity. The long barrel with these channels would essentially allow the shell to be fired multiple times without even leaving the barrel. The best analogy I can think of is when you're playing Mario Kart and you drive on a speed boost. That's basically what's happening inside the barrel. To me, the engineering behind this concept is really interesting, but the weirdest part is definitely the fact that the barrel was literally almost 500 feet long. Despite all the research, development, and resources that were put into this weapon, it wasn't really able to be executed properly. During some demo tests, it wasn't able to meet its hypothetical potential, and before they were able to truly implement it, they were destroyed by the Allied forces bombing and destroying the gun. Later, smaller variants were used on bombing raids against Luxembourg, but that's not what we're talking about here. What we are talking about, however, is something the Russians did that I don't like at all. And you're not gonna like it either. That being anti-tank dogs. Yeah, this one is exactly how it sounds, unfortunately. The Russians were strapping bombs to dogs for them to detonate under tanks. How they do this? Well, in training, they would starve these dogs and then hide food under stationary tanks so the dogs would know to look under tanks for food. They would then bring these same dogs to the battlefield with bombs strapped on their backs. The idea was that the dog would run under an enemy tank and then the bomb on its back would explode. Besides this being extremely primitive and brutal, this technique was also extremely ineffective. On the battlefield, these dogs were extremely scared of these tanks charging towards them, and combined with enemy fire, they wanted nothing to do with these enemy tanks. Also, some of these dogs would go back towards Russian tanks, hiding below them, causing friendly fire. Overall, this method is completely horrible and honestly not great. This technique is pretty on point for Russian military exercises, as their whole mentality is essentially throw bodies at something until the problem's solved. But anyway, staying on trend with explosive animals, we have our next entry, which is explosive rats. This one is interesting because it was a failure that actually turned into a pretty massive success. The British military weapons design team was looking for interesting ways to infiltrate the German infrastructure. Obviously, they were getting desperate because where they landed was explosive rats. This differs from the explosive dogs because these rats were no longer alive. The rats were found, killed, skinned, and essentially taxidermied but filled with a plastic explosive. These rats would be planted in and around coal storages on German bases with the intention of having them be thrown in the incinerator and boilers, triggering the explosive and causing a massive explosion. Now, here's where things get interesting. The Germans early on caught on to these explosive rats, and the British, because of this, stopped producing them. But Germany didn't know that, and because of that, the Germans were extremely paranoid about more explosive rats and spent a lot of resources and man hours strictly checking rats, dead and alive, on all of their military bases. Despite the fact that the rats were more effective than the dogs, and I would say arguably less upsetting, I wouldn't say that this method is much better. For our third and final animal-based entry on the list, we have pigeon-guided missiles. Yep, you heard me right. Pigeon-guided missiles. But unfortunately, it's not as cool as it sounds. The birds that your grandma likes to throw bread at isn't also a double agent. Their primitive brains were just used for tracking, which is still pretty interesting. B.F. Skinner was a psychologist and a passionate pigeon trainer who believed that pigeons could be useful weapons of war. He was ultimately able to prove his theory right, as he was able to teach pigeons how to recognize targets and aim weapons accordingly. The pigeons had specially designed cockpits inside of these missiles which allowed them to peck their way to pick the direction they wanted the missile to go, pecking up, down, left, or right to control the missile accordingly. It's strange and insane to think that pigeons can be trained to literally guide missiles, but it's Also kind of unfortunate that these birds were unintentional kamikazes. What was intentional, however, was our next entry, the Japanese Fugu balloon bomb. These bombs were extremely primitive in nature, being constructed solely out of paper. These paper bombs were huge, 33 feet in diameter for the most part, and could lift up to 1,000 pounds, but all they were lifting were 33-pound anti-personnel fragmentation bombs. The Japanese released these bombs into the Pacific jet stream, which would silently carry these large devices from Japan to the US without any pilot, and the trip would take several days. Despite releasing thousands of these devices, the balloon bomb was extremely ineffective, not to mention resource intensive. It took up to 30 minutes to an hour to prepare one balloon and required 30 hands on deck to create one. During the war, there was only 6 casualties reported from the balloon. A minister's wife and 5 Sunday school children were on a fishing trip encountered the balloon near Oregon, and sadly they fell victim to it. Although for this weapon to be considered successful, it would mean the death of people, which is obviously unfortunate. It is kind of laughable how ineffective this weapon was, considering all the time and energy that went into it. Finally, we have the last entry of this list, the Pajantrum. The Pajantrum never saw combat, but for reasons we'll get into, was a fan favorite amongst civilians. The best way to describe the Pajantrum is a British-made rocket-powered wagon wheel battering ram, if that makes sense. To find a way to breach Germans' concrete defenses in Normandy, the British military devised a large carriage-like contraption called the Pajantrum. The device was propelled by rockets attached along the rim on the outside of the wheel, and in the middle there was a drum full of explosives. The goal was to have the Pajantrum speed towards the wall and break through it and eventually explode. The concept sounds simple enough and honestly kind of makes sense if you don't really think about it. But the biggest problem facing the Pajantrum was the fact that there are so many technical inconsistencies and issues. Rockets blowing off, the wheel going in the wrong direction, not generating enough force to penetrate the concrete wall. Although the general public enjoyed watching the live demonstrations of the Pajantrum, it was never brought to battle due to all of the technical inconsistencies of it. Besides the fact that all of these weapons were complete and utter failures, they all have one thing in common. They are weird. And they sucked. But let me know, which one is your favorite or least favorite? For me, the dog method was the worst by far.